this was filmed back in January of 2024. We have Dave Levinson and Dillion Parish on. We did a game show kind of idea. It didn't go over as well as I'd like to, but I would love audience's opinions on it. We talk about a lot of subjects, everything from reptiles to relationships to actual empathy to actually what Dave Levinson did to start into the hobby. We get into neuroscience, all this different stuff. It actually turned out really well. Dillion didn't talk as much, but he did have things to contribute that were actually wonderful. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. I'll see you guys later. Like and subscribe, guys. All right, guys. Today we've got an epic rap battle of history. Dave Levinson versus Dillion Parish. Animals at home. Fight. It's like, no. He goes, you were actually saying something right before this, Dave, about how you enjoy these. What is that? Like, is it because like you actually get to interact with people that are in your hobby? Is it something like that? Is that why you enjoy these type of interviews, these talks?
Well, to be honest with you, I've been talking reptiles nonstop since I knew what a reptile was as a little kid. So, like, any opportunity to have a conversation, I enjoy. I've always enjoyed debates. Even if I don't agree with somebody, I like to still challenge what they're saying because it really brings out the best in the person in the conversation. And I feel the same way for me. So, honestly, I don't know. I would say it. I just enjoy being part of the conversation.
And we appreciate you for it. And Dillion, do you have anything to say, Dillion, about any of this right now? Real quick?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think one of the biggest problems with our community is most of our communication happens via typing, and it does not work very well. And so even if you have two people who are kind of on different sides, to have them in the same virtual room and to have a conversation and talk makes it so much more fruitful, and we can learn so much more. And then discussions and not even arguments, discussions or disagreements turn into, like Dave is saying, you can learn from each other and push things forward rather than it just ending up into a dumpster fire in the YouTube comments or on whatever social media platform you choose to use. So I agree. Mm-hmm.
This is something that can you guys see the diagram here?
Yeah, sea turtles.
Yes, actually. What's interesting about this is we were talking, Dave, and I can't see you guys right now with the way this screen thing's set up, but we were talking about the science, and we realized that people we spend time with affect how we see the world. So if you're not spending time with people that go through science, you're going to struggle a little bit more with science. And if you spend time with people, just the people you spend time with affect. And which you can see that the brains of most of the sea turtles look completely the same. And there's one that looks like an outlier. It looks like a pile of shit with a little dingly hanging out of it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's the leatherback sea turtle. They live out in the deep, dark ocean that ride the currents. So you can see that their eyes look different because basically they're blind almost. Because the information from the eyes is just nothing there for them to see in the deep, dark ocean. So it changes everything. This is the science of what we were talking about. This is the same science that's in the human brain. And so it's very interesting when we look at that, because it's so the thing that we were talking about before, is the science correct? Yes. If you take away the stimuli, you lose brain cells, you lose the stuff there. That's absolute science. And I have a question real quick, because I find that I kind of shut people down, and I do it because there's an answer to the question. So it's like, why are we constantly asking the same questions? And I feel like I should stop that. How best should I approach that when somebody asks a question that's automatically, because most people's self-esteem often goes into we have this, I want to ask questions so I can be intelligent feeling, but yet they keep asking the same questions that actually have an answer when there are better questions to ask. How can I do that better where I don't come off as a piece of shit? And people will actually want to listen to me more, because I don't want that. This is the reason why I want to do a game show on this. So it's because I want the audience to go, oh, I know that, so that they'll increase their self-esteem into science. I don't want to take away people's self-esteem. So how do you guys think I might go about that better?
Well, I think one of the best ways you can do that is by continuing to ask questions. So let's just say that you have somebody who asks a question that maybe you think is either a repetitive question or a question that they've maybe already asked before, or you think that question can be formulated better to give them a better answer, instead of maybe, as you're saying, shutting them down or making them feel bad because you're sort of telling them that they're wrong. I think you could find questions to ask to help guide that person into the right territory, or to help them explore, or maybe expand on the question that they have, or find points that they may have not thought about before. That way, when somebody comes to you, ask them a question, and when they come to the answer, it becomes a lot more from them, and they're not as offended if it's exactly as you're saying. Like, you're not telling them to do something, you're asking them to do something, and they're basically going to give you the answer that you may have already told, that you may have planned on telling them in the first place, but it's coming from them, which is a lot easier for most people to grasp. I would say just asking more questions of that individual.
Would you agree, Dave? What are your thoughts?
I do agree with that. Also, you got to keep in the frame that, some of these people you're talking to, the stuff you say is so like in another direction compared to anything they understand, that sometimes right off the bat, I feel, depending on the question, if it's too detailed in a way where it confuses them, they'll either put up their defenses and give up a generic answer, or they will, again, just sit there blank-faced or challenge you just for the sake of challenging you because they don't know what to say. I think with a lot of this stuff I find with people is that they just don't understand the conversation, and it makes it really hard to have the conversation because of it.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and that's something I need to work on, but this is also why I want to do a game show, because I want people at home to go, oh, God, I want to increase their self-esteem. I actually love increasing people's self-esteem. It's so great to see people, oh yeah, like, oh God, yeah, like they discovered it themselves. Even though we've known the answer for a long time, I just need to work on my communication skills on that level. And so, Dave, we were talking, and you had a question that I actually found. When for people at home, I didn't realize Dave and me live very close together. And so we were at a show, and this right here, and Dave kind of said something where it's like, okay, I like open-ended questions where there isn't an answer. Like, you really have to satisfy it. And you had a question about the rack system stuff that I would love you to ask, because that's a perfect question, what we should be asking.
Well, here's the thing. We had a long conversation. You might have to guide me back to that one thing I said about rack systems. And then I did have a comment to make about the sea turtles that actually has to do with the conversation we're going to have. The only reason I want to bring up the sea turtle chart before we get into like the details about the ball python thing, and then we'll jump right into the racks, is the thing is that the leatherback, that was evolution. The brain changed for its climate, its living situation, what it had to adapt to. So who knows what the older ones would have looked like, or what the pre-evolutionary ones would. So, get into the ball python conversation of, the brain, the stimulants, giving them something, what do we call it? In nourishment? What's the word you guys been using?
Oh, enrichment?
Right. So I think, just from looking at that chart, right away, the first thing I thought about was how many generations of captive breeding before the brain would start changing in a way to either adapt to the surroundings or not adapt to the surroundings. You know what I mean?
I just have an evolutionary biologist on. I haven't published the episode. Guy here in Wash U, he's the one that did the anole studies. Have you ever heard of anole studies? Did you ever hear of a study where they stretched their arms out to deal with hurricanes that they grew?
No, I just know the annul study at Georgia where they implanted the albino gene embryo into a female and created an albino annul.
That's cool. But no, this guy this guy did things that we tell people not to do. He got a caiman as a child. It's like, yeah, no, you don't do that. We don't do that. And then he actually went and stuck a bunch of anoles on an island.
Okay.
And so his study, and it's like, I did ask him what was the ethics on that, because that's very interesting. We tell people don't release things into the wild, but these are islands that did have anoles on them, and anoles of travel. Like there were anoles that were just 100 feet away in another island. And what you find is that according to what type of environment they have, they actually grow and shrink their limbs accordingly. So the actual more ground level you get, the arms shrink. The more they need to hold on to branches, the arms grow to hold on to those branches. And he found that the change happened after he put them in there, and it only happened in a couple generations. So how fast do you really think evolution happens?
Well, honestly, I do believe that in some cases there is rapid evolution. There was the rattlesnake studies down in Texas where they talked about them being, they started not developing rattles, and the ones with rattles stopped using the rattles, and that was because they realized it was actually getting them killed. So a lot of them, again, started being born without it. And I believe there was also a study down in Texas, and this was like 20 years ago. I had this discussion, so I don't remember all the details, but I believe, you have your hemotoxin and your neurotoxin. There was a certain species of rattlesnake in a certain region that started developing both hemo and neuro, and that happened pretty rapidly in the wild. So here's a question. Is evolution a mutation in your eyes? And is it a mutation that keeps on being passed on from generation to generation?
The evolutionary biologist did answer this because so many people see evolution as. Did you want to answer this, Dylan?
Oh, I mean, just to answer it simply, I would say, yeah, it's definitely mutations. As far as natural selection goes, evolution can be a long process, but as far as natural selection based off of individual mutation or individual variation.
Talking to the evolutionary biologist, natural selection is a small piece of evolution. We actually, looking at it from what we measure, how we measure evolution is not actually about survival. Survival is not actually, it's a piece of evolution. It's not actually evolution. Evolution is how things change over time. That's really what we came down to. It. That's the simplest you can make it that actually becomes correct. And so when you make it that way, and so time is a factor, not the end all be all. It doesn't take millions of years to get evolution. It's really wild to think that there's so many ways to take that question, but it's just about the change. Mutations are just a piece of change. It's just, you're not really even measuring off of just mutations necessarily, just change. Just as simple as that. It's really fascinating because I've had this deep conversation about what evolution actually means. And so it's really cool. If I hadn't had him on, because I've really very fascinated by that. But you were talking about the rack systems and individuality.
I guess my argument of why racks are good or racks are bad?
Not necessarily. It was the babies and racks kind of talk that you wanted to go with.
Oh, like before going to a customer? Like, give me a little direction, man. I talk snakes 24 hours a day. We talked 2 months ago.
Okay, so you asked a question of what do you do with a snake that doesn't eat or whatnot that's out of a rack?
Changing the environment to kind of make it feel more comfortable in a smaller setting to where, similar to like in the wild, here's the thing. and this is just, again, everything that I know is based on watching the animals over the last 20 years, figuring things out based on just what they're doing. A lot of what you guys know is probably a little more based on the books, based on the science. I'm just kind of watching what I've seen over the years. It has been shown, I found with baby ball pythons, that you do shrink their environment down if you're having issues with them getting started. Even an animal that I find is more established, sometimes shrinking that environment to give the animal more confidence, a lot of times will give them the drive to take a meal. And you probably heard me say at the show, like one of the things that I always bring up to people when I'm discussing frozen thawed feeding next to live feeding with an animal is, everybody wants frozen thawed. It's convenient, and I respect that. And we try to do as much frozen thawed feeding as possible because, again, it's convenience. Now, when you present an animal a meal and you're standing over it and you're waving your arms around in the air, it cannot focus on that little meal if it's too afraid of you. Again, it thinks you're a predator. So it will not take a meal from you. But by putting that animal in the same container by itself with a rodent with privacy, a lot of times they'll take it because we are no longer standing over them. That's one of the things I kind of talk about, just like reading the body language of the animal when you're trying to get them to eat. If I go to present a meal to an animal and it seems too afraid of me, I'm a distraction. But as for the smaller environments, I honestly believe, again, it goes down to like the predatory instinct of what's around them that's going to kill them. Am I going to eat this giant meal and be in harm's way if there's a predator around? Same reason why an animal regurgitates a meal before it runs away in the wild. The meal means nothing. Life means everything. So I find with ball pythons, and again, it's not 100%. I don't think anything really is. It's just when I have an issue with the ball python eating, I put it in a very small environment to where the sides of the tubs are touching the side of the animal. And for whatever reason, that gives it the confidence to want to take a meal. So now I don't believe that they should live in a smaller setting constantly for that reason. But, the same thing with like incorporating a hide box into a rack system or incorporating a hide box into a cage. It's essentially, in my opinion, giving the animal more confidence to eat and not be worried about what's going on around it. So that's kind of like the direction I go with that kind of stuff. I'll be honest, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, but I sold a snake to a guy locally. First, he said, I'm having trouble with sheds, and I told him what to do about sheds. He said the animal's eating well, but it wasn't pooping some reason, and I think the not pooping went with the not shedding, in all honesty. And then he sent me a picture of the enclosure, and he added in a tortoise cage, those wooden boxes that half fit screen and the other half's like a compartment it can go into. And don't get me wrong, he had some moss in there and some other things, but like he was having bad shed because there was too much airflow. He had 2 lights on the cage because he thought that was better for the animal. And essentially he was doing everything wrong. But even though he had it in this big enclosure and the animal had to be uncomfortable, he was doing everything wrong, it was still consistently eating, but it wasn't pooping, it wasn't shedding. When it did shed, it had a bad shed. That's me going on a weird little thing right there. But yeah, like I said, I don't necessarily disagree with anything you guys are saying on this whole topic, but I just think there's a little bit of a gray area that we tend to ignore when we talk about this kind of stuff.
That was one of those things I was kind of, I know Dylan's done episodes on this stuff, so if he wants to fill in.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I don't think I disagree with anything that Dave had said there, as far as, definitely I think we've all had snakes that aren't eating and then reducing it to a smaller size, more simple tub or enclosure is like the first thing you do. And it typically works. And I think it's exactly what the reason is what Dave had said is this just comfort. Like an animal's not going to risk eating a meal if it doesn't think it can find a place to comfortably digest that meal safely. Right. And that's just part of raising animals. And then, as in my opinion, the goal is always to take that animal, make sure it's eating comfortably, and then slowly expand its comfort levels by increasing the space that it has. And then that applies to the longevity of the animal as far as giving it the exercise and the enrichment that it hopefully will need. And maybe it's, or that it does need, but it doesn't need to use every day. It's something that it can engage in on a, maybe it's only a monthly basis or a weekly basis in order to just add longevity to the animal by allowing it to do the things that it would definitely do in the wild, as far as looking for food, or maybe it's just finding different zones in the enclosure to set up an ambush hunt or whatever it is. And so yeah, I think that we're basically on the same page as far as using them as a baby scenario or in getting an animal started scenario. And then also I think that this is one of those funny areas where you have people like the example that Dave said, where somebody has just completely botched the husbandry, and then they have an animal that's not, doing the things that it should be doing, whether it's pooping or shedding, and that's obviously due to several factors. One of them would be, you could potentially link it to enclosure size, but really what you'd want to include is the humidity and, too much lighting or too much heat or whatever it was that was causing, you guys are in Missouri, so you probably all have your furnaces blasting, so you're probably like me, 15% humidity during the day, and that animal's going to be dry. So at the end, it also comes down to an education issue for the person buying. Like, they don't know exactly what to do, and it's hard to help everybody in that scenario.
Yeah.
I think one thing that, and now this is a negative, or not a negative, but so when I hear these conversations, I like solutions. I would love to hear what we're telling people as a solution, but one thing that essentially comes back to the breeder over the person giving a recommendation, like when you guys do your thing, is when you guys give a recommendation of what to do, larger enclosure, so on and so forth. When that doesn't work, they don't call you, they call me. And I don't mind having the conversation. I answer the phone for everybody always. But, I will say over the years that, a lot of people have given bad advice. I don't think this topic is bad advice by any means, but I don't think it's a foolproof plan for anybody who's a pet owner. I think there's always going to be variables along the way. And when those variables happen, what are we doing to coach them together, and not so much it depending on the breeder when they get bad advice from somebody else who might decide to put their animal in a tortoise hut. Didn't really make any sense. In his eyes, it was a good idea, but it isn't really working the way it should. It's not a good environment. So that's one thing I was a little bit of pushback is I love the idea of changing things. I love the idea that we can always be better in this hobby, but the process of some people teaching and then other people correcting has always been a problem in my eyes.
Yeah, so it's like we come in, we give these golden solutions and then disappear when shit hits the fan, basically, and then leave the breeders to have to clean up the mess. Yeah, no, I completely get that. And so yeah, that's actually a valid point. It's like, how do you make that so it's not that scenario and make sure people do have the right setting? I think a big piece of what it comes down to is making sure people understand, like having a good understanding of what the environment the animal was in when they bought it. That was always a natural thing for me to buy a new animal. Okay, what can you show me the picture of the enclosure of the tub? And as a new keeper, you typically, or at least I thought, you'd want to replicate that as closely as possible so you can allow that animal to acclimatize to your new home without changing too much. So maybe that's one piece of advice to people is like, whatever the breeder is doing, you should kind of try to replicate to begin with, maybe for the first few months in order to get comfortable, especially if it's your first animal, in order to learn that animal and get it feeding and make sure it's doing all its health checks properly, especially something like a ball python that could live 30 years. It's to do an extra 6 months in a tub to make sure that you understand how to keep that animal is going to pay dividends in the long run of that animal's life.
Yeah. I'm never surprised that some of the oldest animals in the hobby are in the zoo system. But then another thing I always tell people that can keep in consideration is, the breeding aspects of the hobby only really kind of started going in the 90s and really started surging in the early 2000s. So, we don't really know how long.
I want to push back on that.
Oh, go ahead.
Because it's something that I was talking with Bill Stewart, and he's like, oh, well, this guy, he was at a show, and all of a sudden this guy, just random dude, has this 40-year-old python. And it's like, wow, I didn't know they could get that old. I think where that logic falls flat is the fact that zoos advertise and you don't hear from more regular people keeping. I know a lady, she says thinks she had a 21-year-old bearded dragon, but since she didn't have the vet stuff to prove it, she could never get it documented as the oldest bearded dragon. I think that's where I would push back on that. I don't honestly believe that the zoos are always the best thing.
Well, and not so much the best, just they have they've been keeping reptiles longer than the reptile trade has been keeping hobbies and, just pets. So like, you can go based on them and again, when you talk about enclosures, man, I've seen some very unique ball python enclosures at some zoos. I mean, giant enclosures, limbs that they can lay on if they want, everything they could possibly need. So, when we talk about giving an animal everything, when I think about that, I don't think it really gets much better than most zoos, but I understand there's exceptions to the rule.
Yeah. And honestly, what I enjoyed about hearing you talk was about you're talking about the animals as a personality, almost as if they actually have thoughts and desires, and you actually the comfort of them. You don't always hear that in everybody. You don't hear that in animal abusers and animal rights people. That's actually a high sign of a better form of empathy. But empathy doesn't make you a better person. It's a tool. It's very interesting, actually, how that works.
So personally, from just my end of things, the reason that, and we'll put it as it is, it's not so much a sales pitch, but it is part of the sales pitch of making them understand what they're getting themselves into. And I wouldn't say that these snakes have complex thinking in any way. I think you can simplify it in a way where, when you make a comment about trying to present a question to somebody and not getting the response that you'd expect, or maybe just confusing them. That's why when I break down ball python feeding to them, and why the way I usually tell them, just because a breeder in the building says it's on frozen thawed, that's in his conditions, his everything. Just because it worked for him, it doesn't mean it'll work for you when you change everything about the animal. And I think when you simplify it, just again, in that predator, you're a predator in their eyes. Respect that. You're gonna scare them. No different than when you get a dog and cat in. Sometimes dogs and cats can be very afraid of us, and you have to treat every case differently. But again, I feel like, especially in ball pythons, the thinking is very simplified when it comes to just a few things that you need to do when it comes to interacting with them to keep them alive. So I just try to make it something relatable that they can understand without getting into a bunch of stuff that's just going to confuse them, and maybe just make them do it their own way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm always encouraging people to go a little bit further. I want you to introduce your animals together, but with glass between them. So you personally experience the way your animal behaves. You personally do it in a safe manner so that you can experience this. Not just, oh, well, this is what everybody else says. It's no, you get to personally experience it. And it sounds like you're coming from a personal experience deal, whereas the number one pushback that I hear from your community, Dave, against Dillion type of community is that the experience. Well, Dillion, how did you know about what to do with these reptiles? Because you don't own a ball python, right? Or do you?
No, I don't know.
So how do you know that? Because you guys are on the exact same page. So how do you know about that?
How do I know as far as the conditions they should be kept, or maybe pushing us away from the rack scenario?
Yeah.
There's a number of things. One thing that overarches everything, which I think is we have to remember, because we actually are a very small part of the reptile keeping community, the people who keep online and present themselves online. 90% of people who keep reptiles buy one reptile from PetSmart or Petland or whatever it is, and that's what they do. So most of the ball pythons, like 90% of them that get purchased and kept, are bought in a pet store and kept in the classic pet store setup. So there's actually a fair share of ball pythons that are doing well, and the reason you can tell that they're doing well is because the pet stores continue to sell them, right? If PetSmart or Petco was constantly getting returned ball pythons because they weren't eating or dying, they would no longer carry them, right? Or carry them. They would no longer sell them. They continue to sell the crested geckos and the gargoyle geckos and the bearded dragons, which typically people are quite successful with. But ball pythons continue to make it onto the shelves. They have shelf space at all those pet stores, and they continue to sell. So, and the people who go into those stores are typically not keeping them in racks, because again, they're sort of the the one pet type keeper. They're not getting into a breeding situation, at least not to start with. So that's one scenario, that there is many ball pythons that do well outside of those scenarios. But the other piece is, from my point of view, and this is where Dave would probably have more of kind of his finger on the pulse as far as this goes. It was clear to me when I first got into reptiles, or not when I first got into reptiles, but when I started getting into it deeper, that there was a danger with the morph side of things of people over purchasing and ending up with collections that are far too big because of how exciting it is to produce, and the sort of the potential of, you know, having a full-time or part-time business coming through animals. And the barrier to entry to set up an animal in a tub, whether it's a leopard gecko or a snake, is quite low, because it doesn't cost a lot, right? It's easy to get into it. And I mean, I don't think we need to have the conversation of people getting in over their heads as far as buying collections or having to dump their collections and whatnot. And I saw that as essentially a hobby on thin ice. Like that to me is dangerous. If we have a system in our hobby that promotes people keeping a large volume of animals in order to hopefully create something that most people in the long run aren't able to do. I mean, there's nothing wrong with producing animals as a hobbyist, but to hope that it's going to be a huge part-time income for you or a full-time income is a small minority of people. Not a lot of people are able to pull it off. It's not disparaging anybody who tries that. That's just the reality. And we end up with too many animals in conditions that maybe are not the best. And that was my kind of gut feeling when I first got deeper into this.
See, Dillion, I was more looking for the fact that you've had people on your show that actually do the experiments and stuff. So you may not have personal experience, but you've listened to the other people that have actually done the experimentation, that has actually done the stuff, and you actually have published these things that Dave asks have actually started to really get study. You're just not going to hear it from maybe more academic people, but there are out there, and you have talked to them. And then going back to evolution in the door, one of the questions that me and Dave were talking about at the show was the fact that, okay, the question shouldn't be, does the rack system change the neurons in the actual reptile brain? Because it does. The question should be more that, what has the community already done to change the evolution of these animals? Because just keeping them in the community, in the homes, has automatically changed their evolution because of how fast evolution can happen. Like, it's a very interesting question, and that goes back to the morphs and changing their DNA to be more something that you wouldn't see in the wild necessarily. It's very interesting when we get down to the evolution of just what we cause from keeping.
So my little pushback on that is, in my opinion, the most unethical breeding in the pet hobby would probably be dogs, because we took wolves and turned them into these little animals with short snouts. They can't breathe, have all kinds of health issues based on certain characteristics we want to see in the animal. I do agree that in some mutations in snakes do come with problems, but I will say that, what I saw in the beginning of the hobby when I got in is, you had spider ball pythons and they were the most popular thing. Bumblebees in people's eyes were the prettiest animal, and people still love bumblebees today. And then we ran into the spot nose that had some issues. We learned that the cinnamons in the super form had kinking. But when you look at modern day breeding, a lot of people don't really work with those projects now that they have so many things to work with. And I do think there's a lot of other ones that aren't necessarily affected in any way based on the color pattern or any changes that we're doing, different paint jobs, I always put it. But I do think there are some things that, in crested geckos and some of the mutations or some of the line bred traits, you get really bad underbites. We've seen in the red project and blue tongue skinks, you get a little bit of an underbite. I do think that there are some things, again, be cautious about and have an understanding before you go into it. But like I said, I don't think a lot of these color mutations are necessarily completely changing the biology or the health of the animal, because it hasn't really been proven yet.
Well, we know that it has been proven. The problem isn't that it hasn't been proven. The problem is we can't truly, because there's no money in this to actually dive deeper into the genetics other than how they look. So we know that the way the colors work is actually correlated to their actual genetics. It's just there's so much more to that there's no way to simplify it without more cost, and it's so hard to get funding for things like that. So we may not see the signs, but we do know they're there.
Can you give me an example? Like you said, they've done studies. Like, was there a mutation example? Are we just talking about the trouble problem, or like?
We're talking about in general because we know. Okay, so let's take like hair and skin color and things like that of humans. We know that their genetic and the actual impact on more things than what was it we were talking about? You actually said something. You said something at the show. You were talking about skin color, and there was a deal there, and it showed that the vitamin D with darker skin.
Yeah, I think it was a study where they were talking about like different, like people who are I don't know how you appropriately say this, African Americans.
Yeah.
In Africa that darker pigment served a purpose where here it doesn't. And it had something to do with sunlight and so on and so forth, absorbing vitamin B, I want to say. I don't remember what that study was. I want to say it was something related to COVID that I was listening to, where they talked about different people getting affected in different ways. And that was part of the study. I'd have to go freshen back up. More than likely, that was something I listened to that week where it was relevant, but it's nothing I've talked about since. But I'll find that for you. But it had something to do with pigments. And I do agree that some pigments can change things. But I agree. Albinos are blind, or they have really bad eyesight. So a certain lizard species, like geckos, let's say iguanas are a good example. Iguanas need a lot of light. And when you put a blind animal that has very sensitive eyes underneath this blinding light, I don't think that's good for the animal. So in my opinion, that's a fail to thrive mutation that probably shouldn't be worked with, but it's still being worked with.
High five, Dave, because honestly, you answered the question that you asked. That you answered it yourself, because within that shows us that the color mutations can have an impact on other factors in their genetics, but we don't know what that is.
We know.
Yeah, so therefore we know it can, we just don't know what.
Yeah, the albino, in my opinion, is probably one of the more obvious ones that we talk about. But, in ball pythons, there's 300 mutations. There will never be a study that we'll do where we'll go over all 300 to figure out what the issues are, unless it's something that we can obviously see, kinking, something neurological, and like you're talking, and with a lot of these case studies, we don't really have a big sample size when it comes to time. But the pastel ball python came around a little over 30 years ago. We talked to Graziani about it probably about 3 years ago on a podcast. And this was exciting to me at the time, but he was taking a female that I believe he named Tobo. And she was a 27-year-old ball python that he still had in his collection. And the relevance to her is the first clutch he ever got from his original pastel out of the wild was to that female, and 27 years later he was going to do the exact pairing with the exact male and the exact female to essentially recreate the first clutch of pastels ever created. And I thought that was super unique. I probably would have paid a couple extra bucks just to have that animal, because I think there's something cool about that. It probably isn't worth anything more to a lot of people, but to me, I was like, well, that's cool. But now we're talking about a mutation, a male ball python that's 27 years old in captivity, a female that's easily 27 years old, probably well over 30 now, and that animal's doing just fine. But that's not really a red flag mutation in my opinion. But there are other red flag mutations.
And so we know that we can learn the same lessons from experience, from other people's experience. you can even learn it from your imagination if you can start to gain the knowledge and use your empathy and imagination together. I can show that in other ways. So these are ways that we still can learn. And that's one of the things that I wanted to get to, because I've heard so many people in your community, Dave, that are like, well, if you don't experience it yourself, you don't know. Like, you don't, it's like, well, I don't. So you're telling me that a snake nose has been taken away from a bird? So every single snake fears a bird because that snake has been moved by a bird, been attacked by a bird. So because that snake did not experience being attacked by a bird, and it still knows to be scared of a bird because it has an imagination. So this is very interesting, the way we learn. And so that's one of the big pushbacks. And I think so we can learn the same lessons and take different paths. So it's almost, how fast do you want to learn it is almost a good question. And how do you learn personally? And one of the pushbacks I want on Dillion, you said something that I was like, with Arcadia guy, that I'm like, no, you're completely out of base here. You said these animals should not have fear. Now, when we look at the brain of these reptiles, I've talked about that they have the modeling part of empathy. So that's in the optic tantrum. We have it, they have it. So when you yawn, I yawn. That's the same thing. They have that because they need to know when everything around them is afraid. They need to know that they need to be afraid. So they feel that. My emerald swifts, all of a sudden I have two over here. They're in the exact same posture as this one over here. This one jumped because I scared it. These two jump in the exact same way. It's the same thing as you and me yawning because of that. It's the same part of that brain. That is still there and still being used because of fear in the wild. So if we lose that fear, we might lose that piece of the modeling. So we can never release them back in the wild. We have issues like, okay, so we can't allow, their brains can't grow to be more social without it. It will struggle. What's your thoughts on that? Anybody?
Well, I think I'd have to remember the context that I said that in, but I think just judging off my own personal feelings of it, I could probably imagine what I was saying. But as far as, I mean, I think you would separate the difference between animals that you were planning on rewilding and animals that you weren't. Obviously, if you were actually planning on releasing animals back into the wild in a proper setting, you probably would have a lot less human interaction with those animals to make sure that they still have the proper fears. I imagine the point I was attempting to make is, in the same way you don't want your dog to be cowering all the time, is the same sort of fear that I think we should avoid having in a captive environment, most of the time. Stress is actually really important. Yeah. We stress ourselves out all the time for the benefit, right? Whether it's maybe fasting yourself or exercise is a really good example of healthy stress. So there's many different reasons why you might want to stress a biological organism, but to put an animal into the fight or flight, am I going to die in this next scenario, in an overextended period of time, I think is something that in captivity we want to work out. We want to avoid that. Especially if this is an animal that you're planning on breeding and hopefully passing on genetics to make good quality pets. You don't want an animal that poops as soon as it sees you. Animals that are so afraid that it can't even exist in the same environment as you as a human. So you want to be able to have an animal that has an environment that it's in, that is comfortable enough to be able to, whether it's scoot away into its hide or go off into the foliage or something, in order to allow its fight or flight system to turn off in a way that it's not at that 10 out of 10 I'm afraid of death at all times in captivity.
Yeah. I would agree with that one. That's a very important thing that I've tried to make distinction of. I've heard so many people, don't stress, you're stressing them out. It's like they're mentally stimulated. In 20 minutes they'll go back to their hides and stuff and they'll be fine. Like I don't like, they're not overstimulated. If you overstimulate, like I talk about the bearded dragon beard and how it actually does not activate automatically. It takes a minute. I literally have a film that I have showed on this channel where it takes the beard to get dark like a minute. after the initial encounter that it gets dark because of the way their brains are designed. Now, if you increase that, if that becomes something that's normal for them to be overstressed, they should be able to kick it on instantaneous because it's always in that mode. So then you see the difference between stress and overstress, and you should see that in their behavior with the comfort and discomfort. Even Imperial Exotics, who actually knows his shit, gets stuff wrong. He talked about his snake as being like, oh, well, this thing's in venturous mode, this Burmese python. And it's like, no, it's not. It's uncomfortable. It's not really scared, but it's uncomfortable. So the way we see these things is so important to understand that stress and the comfort and discomfort is more important than just, leaving them alone to have no stimuli. This shouldn't be a prison.
So without me reading any of these papers, are these papers more saying we shouldn't keep animals in captivity, or are these, here's how I feel like we should keep animals in captivity?
I'm not reading those papers as often. I'm doing this off of listening to people and the fact that I have a higher understanding of neuroscience and stuff than other people. So it's actually my understanding of neuroscience. Most of the neuroscience stuff that I do is because I understand it in a way that most people couldn't do right off the bat. Even that evolutionary biologist was like, wow, like he didn't know half of the stuff that I was talking about.
Well, what about you, Dillion? Do you feel like a lot of these conversations are more based on we shouldn't be keeping animals, or you think it's more just on we should be doing it better?
I think it really depends on where you're, like what source you're getting from. Any papers that I've seen written in this topic are typically in the orient of trying to do better, and it's normally in a zoo environment where you're actually trying to take animals. Like one of the issues with measuring stress and corticosteroid response in animals is, the act of measuring stress can cause stress. Like capturing an animal and measuring blood. It's like, was the animal stressed in its environment, or did it get stressed because you're pinning it down and pulling and drawing blood? And now, it's really messy doing those sort of things. So a lot of those papers are just trying to analyze, okay, how do we actually measure unwanted stress in a captive animal, and B, if we can, how do we reduce that? Because I think, as I was saying before, I think it is important that we attempt to reduce the fight or flight fear in an animal, and that we know stress is a horrible. Too much stress is very bad. It causes all sorts of things. It can be catabolic to your body. You start breaking tissues down. You're not sleeping well. I mean, this is the same reasons that humans don't want to be stressed all the time is the same reason we don't want our captive animals to be stressed all the time. So anyway, a lot of these studies have to do with zoo animals, and how can we improve in this case? Now, of course, there are the animal rights groups that just go, oh, that animal is in a small
real enemies. That's the real.
Well, yeah. I mean, they look at it from a bad faith side, right? They don't give us
animal rights. It's not either of our side. That's the actual real enemy. The real enemy is the animal rights people who do actually lie and manipulate data to serve their purpose.
I think both sides will probably do that if given the opportunity, in all honesty.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a human nature thing. But Dave, what do you think about the fear thing? Like, as far as, do you think that we should be attempting to reduce, like, well, maybe we'll call it absolute fear in captivity, or is that something that you don't concern yourself with?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, that all comes down to setting up an animal properly and reducing the stress level as much as possible. But, I still think that, I'm trying to think how to put this. There's certain things in an animal that are instinctual. So I guess the question would be, can you breed those instincts out of them? Because if instinctually a bird's always going to scare them, a bird's always going to scare them, even 5 generations later. Do you guys know about like breeding foxes in Russia?
Yes, yeah.
And you understand that concept. They took a really nice one that was friendly and bred it to another one that was friendly, and then made more friendly foxes to the point where they were available in the pet trade.
Yeah.
If you can get an animal to And I say frozen thaw is a good example because, again, if a distraction of you standing over an animal and it willing to take a meal from you to become helpless in that moment tells me that that animal is comfortable. So with the, okay, again, because I believe, let's do some experiments here. Like if you get an animal to eat frozen thaw its entire life, and let's say ball python is the case study, and it does frozen thaw its entire life through its adulthood, it breeds, would a higher percentage of its babies be comfortable and be willing to take frozen thaw because the parents were, or is it going to be a case-to-case basis?
Yeah,
I hate that word. I'm sorry. I hate that word, instinct. It's almost like common sense. It means we don't need to look any further because you should already just know it. Almost like that. And it's like there's so much more deeper knowledge to be had. And it's just simplifying the brain thing down. You use it or lose it. That's the way the body works. And so when we say instinct, it's like, no, there's actually a spot in the brain for ego. There's actually a spot in the brain to sense fear of other people. There's actually spots in the brain. So anything that's neuroscience can be moved. Any vertebrate should have the same things. It just depends on if they've been using it. It's very interesting, and that's why I've hated using those type of words. It's the reason why you don't ever hear me say common sense, because you could pull somebody out of the jungle and put them in New York. They should automatically be able to realize that car is driving really fast, but they don't have any, it's not, their brain shouldn't do that actually. Like they actually shouldn't realize that. The only thing you could ever use common sense for is pooping, because any human on Earth that is within 24 hours old or older, everybody should have an understanding of pooping. Anything other than that, you should actually talk about it and try to dive deeper into it. And that's where I think instinct goes wrong, is it's just they just have instinct. It's like, no, there's actually a logical basis in the brain for that.
I still like the word instinctual. I'll push back with you on that. I think that, comparing, like, here's the thing, not every brain's the same. Some brains are more simplified than others. Even us instinctually, we know certain things, even if we didn't have to ever deal with it in our life. And I do agree with that. Just because you didn't see it your entire life, it doesn't mean instinctually you can't look at it and understand what's happening across from you. But I think, to one of my biggest pushbacks, and I brought it up with Dylan last time we talked, was we picked ball pythons as a case study. There are so many different reptile species that, in my opinion, are more intelligent than other ones. You could just tell by their body language. You could tell by everything about them that they just have a better understanding of what's going on with them. It almost feels like sometimes, like I always say, retics, indigos, king cobras, like when you watch those animals interact with people, who's in control there? Like, in my opinion, sometimes these snakes are more in control than the person is, and the person's just working around the animal. But
and I have answers to those.
Oh, and I'm sure there is. And like I said, finding the proper way, like, you throwing instinctual completely out, instinct not being a thing, man, that's got to be discouraging for people when you're trying to teach them something. You tell them straight.
Thank you for saying that. I need to hear that. Yeah, I need to hear that. I need to recognize that. So I may need to start quantifying instinct as, okay, instinct is just neurological conditions that we need to understand better.
Well, here's the thing. Without understanding the brain, is there like something like, you got a little helmet you could put on a ball python that a certain light will turn on when it's hungry, or a certain light will turn on before it's got to poop, or a certain light will turn on when it's scared? Like, can we actually look at something in the ball python's brain to know what it's thinking before we even know? Like, you know what I mean? Like, can you tell a certain thing? Like
that technology, because you have to sedate them to get that experience. That's the only problem. Otherwise, yeah, you're right. Like, I've been trying to figure that out myself, try to figure out how I might do that. What's interesting was I would love to do a study where we take a ball python, because we know that they like to have things touching them, and it stretches that medulla So, like, our medulla is down here. Like, this white spot right here is actually our medulla, and it has hormones and stuff in it. It's actually what's inside. It has some of our hormones and stuff. And we see a kink in it in reptiles that like to have things like bury themselves, even if it's in rock systems, because it stretches that medulla. And it's something I asked that question, what's the difference between a rainbow boa's medulla and a ball python's medulla? That's it. It's actually the fact of sensory overload. And so if we could actually allow a rainbow boa and a ball python to escape an enclosure, and then turn that enclosure around and allow them and see how they try to escape it again, and then use a completely acrylic enclosure, we could actually test their tactile senses. Because you would think the ball python having a bigger medulla would have more tactile senses. But yet that's not necessarily the case, because it may have an overload of tactile senses. So the rainbow boa might actually do better, but the ball python might do better. It's a very interesting question. And these are the ways that we would have to study that.
Okay.
And it's an easy study.
And by the way, Dylan, I'm so sorry about it. It's like we're not even getting a conversation. I want to hear more from you in this. I feel like I'm actually asking questions and getting answers. But like, okay, well, here's a case study then. Going back to me saying the word instinctual. Desert species are typically opportunistic feeders, and that's why you can push a desert species to obesity, because they're going to eat anytime you offer them food, because in their head, take advantage when it's there. It's not always going to be there. Why is that? And why is that not instinctual? What part of the brain is telling them, I got to eat nonstop because tomorrow there might not be a meal?
Yeah, I think that there is definitely some genetically passed down behavior that is, I think you can call it instinctual. I mean, there are certain things, like even deeper than that, there's something called in humans or in mammals, the mammalian diving reflex, which is something that if you have a child, you put a baby underwater and they instinctively hold their breath. And even more so, if you were to actually measure their biometrics, their heart rate drops and they actually relax. And every mammal does that and that's what it's called, the mammalian diving reflex. And it's something that we have encoded into us to allow our bodies to actually physiologically change when we're going into an underwater situation. And, obviously millions of years of evolution, we've come from the water at some point. So maybe that's something that's just been carried on through all mammals. Who knows why? Obviously there's a lot of mammals that live inside water as well. So there's definitely certain things that are, I think, and I think that would be an example, the opportunistic eaters in arid environments, that anything that moves they're going to eat, because there's an instinct that tells them that every calorie that passes is an important one and that they have to take advantage of it. So I think that there is, and the reason we kind of went down this path originally was kind of talking about that domestication piece. And I think that there is tons of evidence of breeding in captivity is actually changing some of those innate behaviors, whether it's like a fear of humans or, over time, all animals, or many of the reptiles that we work with in captivity, are becoming more social to humans, whether that's, I'm not necessarily talking about holding them and playing with them, but having just less fear in general. And I even know breeders one for an example, that works with leopard geckos, who specifically breeds for both. She line breeds, but she's also looking for behavior. And if she has a beautiful leopard gecko that is afraid of her or afraid of her hands after working with her for 3 months, that animal doesn't end up in her breeding program. So she only ends up keeping, I think it was like 3 or 4% of her animals to go back into her breeding program, because she's extremely strict about both health, the frame of the animal and the behavior of the animal. So there are I think there's every being has some molding that can happen over generations. And that's the magic of being in captivity, is how we essentially take the natural selection process and put it on steroids because of how quickly we can create generations down the line. It's not going to happen quite as quick in the wild. So I don't know if that answers. I think that I do agree with you, Dave, that there is some instinct that comes out of the egg or comes out of the womb, however you want to look at it.
Yeah, and Daniel, one thing too, because I know you're going to want to chime in on this, but okay, so again, going back to that leopard gecko breeder, she said that she would typically hold back the calmest ones to breed because she wants those characteristics passed on.
Correct. Yeah.
only 3 or 4% of them are actually passing on those characteristics that made them worth holding back. So 3 out of 100, 4 out of 100.
Well, I think it's not that, it's not just the socialization. It's like a Venn diagram, right? Because she's also looking for healthy eyes, healthy joints, good coloration, and all the other things. So maybe there's like a 40% chance that the behavior gets passed on, but only a 20% chance that the color gets passed on, and only a 10% chance that the healthy joints gets passed on. So by the time you layer on all those different probabilities, you're left with a very small amount of animals out of a clutch that hit every one. It's like hitting a royal flush every time. It's, the chances are quite small.
Well, and I'd just be curious after a few more generations of doing that, certain things that she notices, if that, like I said, back to the fox study, can personality be inheritable?
Yeah, I think probably to some extent it can be. I mean, I know she bases a lot of her work off of that fox study. So, and I think too, I mean, you work with ball pythons, right? Back in the 80s, they were not the best animals to work with. They were striky, and, a lot of them maybe were wild caught. So that's a slightly different scenario. But now you're dealing with a much more placid animal, something that's more laid back and relaxed. And even boas, I mean, I work with boas. It'd be hard to imagine a wild caught boa being as calm as the ones that I have. They just open the door and they slither out calmly. They've never showed any aggression to me at all. But if you found one in the rainforest in Colombia, that would be a different story.
Yeah.
So who knows? Is that nature versus nurture? Is it just because of the scenario that they've been born into, or is it because of years of, captive breeding with calm animals? I don't know.
So I've got a pretty unique case study that I'm going to be able to do pretty soon, or not an experiment, but a curiosity for me. I'm a Levinson. Levinsons are fucking crazy, buddy. My brother's crazy.
Neighbor.
My father was extreme. His father was somebody. We got this Levinson swagger about us. I just found out the other day, I've got an uncle I didn't know about who was 2 years older than my father from a previous marriage to my grandfather. Didn't even know my family existed till last week. Didn't even know he was a Levinson. I'm going to go meet him in a couple of weeks when I'm down in Florida. Ironically, he was living near my father for the last 20 years. Now, here's the thing. There's certain things that all Levinsons have in common. I want to see if this guy, even though for the last 62 years of his life has not been around a single Levinson, is he still a Levinson deep down? What characteristics does he have that my father, my brothers, and my uncles all had that he inherited, even though he didn't grow up with us?
Yeah.
I grew up, somewhere back home there was a Levinson, and it just hit me just that moment where it's like, wow. I'm from the backwoods of Missouri, so it's like, wow, like,
They're out there.
that didn't hit me. Like the name didn't recognize till you said it, and I'm like, oh wow, I can't remember who it was, but I grew up with a Levinson somewhere. Dave, I love you, Dave. I love you, man. The reason why I say it like that is because there's so few people who are willing to shut me down. And I actually do have respect for people that'll do it because you did it to get Dillion talk time. I love that. Thank you so much.
It's not your fault. It's our fault. And the way I say that is I love hosting podcasts. But the problem is I always have so much to say. It's finding the balance of saying what I want to say in a very limited fashion because it's not about us. It's about who we interview. So, there's always that balance there that I find is tough because, again, I love talking. And that's why I bounce around in all these different podcasts. It's a little more freedom to be able to say more, where when I talk, usually on mine, I limit myself a little more because it's more about the person and guiding them in the direction of the conversation I want to have. And I want to bring Dillion in because I'm staring at him the whole time. I feel bad for the guy, man. I watched this go back and forth 6 times.
Yeah.
If you ever want to co-host, man, because I love that so much because I've been wanting to do that more. And I just want people out there to know, DK Exotics, Dakota, he did the same thing. And I don't think enough people realized how much I respected him for that. And I want to correct something that I've said on other podcasts. I thought I had made a mistake and I had misidentified a cat's brain for an iguana brain. I did not. Google screwed it up. The cat brain does not look like an iguana brain. It has the same parts. It just wrinkles, and the cat's forebrain overlaps the actual optic tantrum way more than a reptile does. It's completely different looking. The smooth brain of reptiles is very interesting, and I had questions because the way memory works is that your memory, when you look at something, it changes. Like every time you look at it, it changes. So you're never actually looking at the same memory, the exact same. That's not how the brain works. So you are adapting it. And so somehow my brain has adapted the two images that Google screwed up and like adapted them together. When I looked at that study this morning, it's like, oh yeah, no, like that's, yeah, no, I was completely wrong. So when we look at autism versus a regular person, by the age of 2, there's an overgrowth in the brain. That's the reason why that's the reason why they don't get the same type of, freaking connections that a normal person does through childhood. And so when we look at like a cat's brain and the cat actually gets the wrinkles, why do you guys think the brain wrinkles? The human brain?
I have the only thing I would say is surface area. I mean, obviously you're increasing surface area, but I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
That's completely right. It's just to take in more information by increasing surface area. Same thing as like that medulla. It crinkles because it needed to create more surface area because of the input that it had. So it's what we see with the reptile brain. Why does the cat need to be taught to hunt while the sea turtle automatically knows where to go? Well, what would happen if a sea turtle brain creases? It would probably lose. Well, do you guys have an answer to that? What would happen?
I don't know. I was going to ask a follow-up to that. Dylan, you got anything on that?
No, I don't know.
Yeah. When you mentioned that, like knowing where to go or whatever else, I know this is a little bit different, but hasn't it been said in like studies about like salmon and migratory sea turtles that there's like some almost like magnetic force that draws them back to where they need to be?
When we look, going back to that sea turtle at the beginning, it has the biggest range of any reptile in the world. The leatherback. The brain is actually basically the same size as a normal one with none of the actual lumps, because your sight takes up so much brain power. Do either of you guys know what part of the brain does the wobble in ball pythons?
No, but I want to know.
Dylan should know, right? You know?
I have no idea.
The ear.
Oh, it's the ear. Okay.
It's actually the bones.
Okay, so the bone structure is different in a spider ball python compared to a normal ball python?
Yes. So that right there actually that information does go into the optic tantrum like sight automatically does, but it takes so little. Everything else besides your sight takes up so little space in the brain. It's so interesting how that actually works. Your brain is so much sight. It's unreal. Just our smell is 1% of our brain power. Our OL stock, but yet it goes straight into the forebrain. That's why it's the strongest to bring up memory, because memory is in the forebrain. It's really fast.
With it being a developmental issue, I've always heard arguments in the hobby where some people will say they'll incubate their spider ball pythons at a lower temperature, maybe 84 to 86 compared to 88. And they think that slower development actually helps the animals, but I've never seen that proven ever. We don't do as many spiders as we used to, of course. I mean, I feel like the whole hobby's got away from them. I do have some older ones we still play with a little bit, but I've noticed I haven't noticed anything different in my I haven't noticed anything different in the neurological end of it, but I have noticed that like some of my really old school females that I just still have, like their babies don't come out like they do. Some of the early spider ball pythons, man, these things were insane, neurological, the craziest thing you've ever seen. I don't see it as much as I used to. Why do you think that is? Like, I'll be honest, they don't wobble like they used to. Spider ball pythons do not wobble like they used to. Is that just generations? They wobble a lot less.
Okay, interesting.
I have some that don't wobble at all. I find that usually a stressor will create a little bit of a wobble. Sometimes I say in the ones that have minimal wobble, it look like they rev the engine a little bit before they strike at a meal. And another thing about spider ball pythons is, man, they are the best feeders in my collection. Spider ball pythons never say no. Like, they are always willing. What do you think that's about?
That's interesting. I mean, I do wonder if just potentially over time, less wobble is due to people breeding animals that had less wobble, kind of going back to what we're talking about with the domestication or the socialization. I mean, maybe the animals with extreme wobble back in the day were actually very difficult to breed. So just by virtue of almost like a artificial natural selection, we end up with animals that are less wobbly just because we're breeding less wobbles. But at the same time, there's still something else happening with the spiders, right? Because there's a serious, it's a recessive issue if you have a homozygous pair, right? Or if you create you can't really, it's an animal that dies. So there's something else. There's more to that genetic story, I think, but it is interesting to know that the wobble has been decreasing. And the food thing, I don't know. I've heard that by tons of ball python breeders. They say like, yeah, the spiders eat really, really well. Who the hell knows why that is? That's actually really fascinating.
Well, if one sense is weakened, maybe another one's strengthened. Maybe they realize there's something about them that's not as strong as other animals. And again, they just take advantage of every chance they get to eat. Maybe they already know that they're, special.
Could be. Who knows?
I'm special too, guys.
Special enough, buddy. Special enough. Special in a lot of ways. So what do you think? Should we just start doing lobotomies on ball pythons before we sell them?
We might have to.
I have an answer to this. There was a lady a while back. I had wrote on an email or a post that I wanted a red-bearded dragon just to name it Hannibal. It's like, yeah, and you get the gist too, Dylan, right? Hannibal.
Yeah.
And so this lady wrote me. And it's like, I get these all the time. It's like, well, do you own a red, are you looking for a red-bearded dragon? And I didn't answer because every now and then I'll get those people trying to sell you something online. And so a few days later, she writes back a bunch of question marks. And I'm like, I'm not really looking for another beardy. It's like my grandfather said it best when it comes to kids. I wouldn't take $1 million for any of my kids, but I wouldn't give a nickel for another one. That's the way I feel about bearded dragons. You can't have my bitch. Pitch the bitch. No, that's my baby girl. But I really don't want another one. And so she goes, yeah, they have, genetic problems. They have, and it's like, I was wondering that because of the inbreeding and stuff. Like, I was wondering that myself. And she said that she had one with a wobble. And when we understand, usually I don't get as much concern about the wobble. Then you start talking about the life, like the quality of life is more what you should be concerned about with that. No, don't rebreed it, but go, okay, so what's the quality of life that this is? Because when we see bearded dragons that flip over, that is actually a neurological condition that is probably akin to Parkinson's disease or something along those lines, where it's actually the medulla and the cerebellum, the actual nervous systems there that are actually being damaged, and so they're actually misfiring. And so the bearded dragon that's always like landing on its back, yeah, you actually need to put that down, because there is an actual neurological condition that is causing that deeper, and the quality of life is not going to be there. Whereas and I mean, I'm sitting here crying before work and I'm running late because I'm feeling this. I have a lot of empathy. And so it's like, I just feel so bad. It's like, what is the quality of life? Because she's thinking about euthanizing her red beardy. And so it's like, she's like, no, it's the quality of life's not bad. It's like that. And so then she shows me a video. And this video, the thing's just like mad and just trembling. And I'm like going, boy, that is not the wobble that I thought. What that is an overload of the sensory, much like when you get mad and you also start to cry because you're so mad and your sensories are just going off so much in your brain. That's what that was. Now, I'm not saying that it should be like that, but that animal was overstimulated in a anger or something direction that caused it to be wobbling. It's the like that. It wasn't necessarily wobble. It was the I'm so mad wobble. It was very interesting to when you start to take that, because oh my god, that put my mind at ease, and I was able to go to work without just crying my eyes out at this thing. It's very interesting when we get down to that. What's your guys' thought?
Dylan?
I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to say. I mean, when you really do start inbreeding, you will end up with certain conditions. So whether any of these wobbles are related to each other, or it's just a manifestation of several different problems that end up just due to poor genetics. There's so many different things. It's like an underbite in dogs or something along those lines. Maybe, well, that's maybe not the best example because an underbite in dogs is probably just due to underbite genetics. But or like maybe you could think of like a heart condition or hips, for example. That might be better. Like dogs with bad hips. Maybe dogs with bad hips it's not all the same problem. Maybe some of them have like a femur issue and some of them have like a ligament issue, but it all ends up being like hip dislocation. So I think wobbling could be the same sort of scenario where it's like, yeah, the manifestation or the symptom that we see is a wobble, but internally, like under the hood, there are different causes and different reasons for some of these animals to display these issues. I think at the end of the day, it's obvious that it's just due to genetics. Like there's some poor genetics there, and whether or not it's affecting quality of life, I think that's more of an ethical question than anything.
Yeah. I think, comparing even like in human beings, the anomalies that we have, brain development. I had an uncle with an extra thumb. I think that some things just happen. And, I don't even know if it's always necessarily through inbreeding. I think of like species that are like isolated to an area, like, we could easily go Galapagos, but like Mangshank vipers, I believe that their entire population is on like just a couple hundred acres of land, I believe. Or it might be a little bigger, might be a little smaller, but it's a very small region that you could actually find these guys in. And, I'm assuming they're still thriving. God knows how long that species has been there. I don't know what isolated them to such a small area, but without knowing a lot about the species, I don't think you would think if they were inbred for so long that eventually something would take over and kill them, or natural selection just takes care of those. Here's a weird thing. So hognoses. First off, love hognoses, love their personalities, love their quirks. I just like that they show their emotions on their sleeve. It's easy to know what's going on with them. 2 points on them. So my one buddy breeds a lot of hognose, and if there's a hognose that is born in a clutch and it's got a kink and moves erratically, there's a very good chance one of the other hognoses are going to eat it. The why? I don't know. It could be the movement, but something about that erratic movement of that kinked animal will get another one to try to eat it.
Like another
also,
one of its
what he's
clutch
noticed with what's that?
Like one of its clutch mates?
Yeah, clutch mate will actually try to eat the baby.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow, that's crazy. That's cool.
And because he's actually seen it happen. Another thing that he noticed with feeding them is, so what he does is he keeps all the babies in the box together until they shed. And then after they shed, instead of setting them up and feeding them, he will offer a meal to one of them in the bin. When he finds one in the bin that'll take the meal, all of a sudden it'll be like a chain reaction where all the other ones will be willing to take a meal too. What it is about it, I'm not 100% sure, but again, I don't know if that's Mother Nature just doing its part. Eat one that's weak because you don't want that passed on. The same reason why in skinks, if a weak male tries to grab a female and she fights him off, she does not want those genetics passed on to another generation.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely some learning that happens, which is really fascinating, and that might be just what you're seeing when you get a clutch mate to eat, and then suddenly it like wakes them up, or they just they see another animal eating, and it makes them realize, that they can do that too. I mean, if you look at the history of like wolves and coyotes in the United States, there was a time in the 1800s where they were really just trying to eradicate them completely. And by the time they got to the end of, you know, the wolf populations, especially, and the coyote populations, until they were quite small, those last few that were around, of course, the populations have recovered now just due to efforts. But when they were quite small, those last few were incredibly difficult to trap and kill, because they were capable of passing down generational information about how to make sure what they used to use all the time is strychnine, right? They would kill an animal and then they would lace it with poison. The wolves would come and eat it and they would die. Suddenly you have a group of a wolf pack that refuses to eat anything that smells like strychnine. They actually will move away from it. So there's some amazing learning that happens in the animal kingdom that we probably don't necessarily pick up on until you start to see these sort of generational examples. And so who knows what's going on with the hognose, but it's really fascinating that that's the case. And that's an insight that only a breeder would get to. A breeder who's been frustrated getting tiny snakes to eat, right? Like he probably spent how many clutches separating them and trying to get these little guys to eat, putting toad scent on them and all this stuff. And then you find out something so simple, which actually makes sense because they're all hatching in the same spot in the wild. And they're probably, you know, that's probably how it happens naturally. So that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's one of the great things too. And, you know, when we talk about this hobby being just so young, you know, breeders are the ones that are learning a lot about what's right and what's wrong. And we don't always get there the right way, I guess you could say, if you want to make that argument. But it used to be thought in the industry that ball pythons were difficult to breed. Everybody struggled to get their ball pythons to breed. Now, from a beginner level person, if they come in the hobby, you give them a couple ball pythons, if they just do what needs to be done, I say 9 out of 10 of them will get that animal to breed at some point. Where back in the day, the smartest people in the hobby couldn't figure it out. And, you know, when you watch old videos by Tracy Barker with VPI, like, you know, they used to keep their ball pythons in these like 6-foot gray vision cages with like a big Tupperware inside with some cypress mulch and this, that, and the other thing. And it wasn't that we were trying to figure out a way to commercialize it. And I'm sure in some parts there was a way we were thinking about commercializing it, but it was when we actually shifted to rack systems that I think that breeding actually improved with that species. And again, that could come down to comfort level, something as simple as that. But, you know, a lot of people always look at it from the negative side of things, that we do certain things in a certain way because we're just trying to maximize profits and whatever else. But also we've learned over the years that some of these species just do well in other conditions. You know, that's kind of like one of my big pushbacks. I understand there's a giant sample size of ball pythons, but I told Dylan, I would love to do an experiment with garter snakes. I would love to raise 10 garter snakes, 10 different ways, some in colonies, some without. And I bet you that'll actually show a case study, because there's something special about garter snakes that I've always really loved garter snakes. They're, like I said, another inquisitive species. I love that they do better communally. I don't know. I just think of a lot of snakes. Garters are one that I would love to see some case studies on garters.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting social stuff. Let me do something real quick here. So, window, share my entire screen. Okay. Here's bearded dragon brain. As we look here at the front, I'm going to explain this for a reason. And then, are you guys open to doing the maybe like a little game show real quick?
Sure.
Yeah.
We should probably do that, because I should probably wrap up relatively soon. I got to get doing some work. So if you want to move on to that game show, I'd be happy to do that.
So this will be important. So we see this blue line in front. That's the OL stock. I don't know if that deals with the all reptiles have all these parts. So this OL stock actually deals with smell and taste. I don't know if it deals with the actual sensory in front of the heat pits, but this is a bearded dragon brain, so you're not going to see that here. The red is the forebrain, and it has the dual hemispheres, because the right side of the brain is imagination, the left is memory retrieval. The whole thing is memory. it holds. So this is also the part where you make decisions. The pink at the bottom, the purplish pink, that's an optic nerve. It's actually not in the eyeballs. This orange in the middle is actually the thalamus. I think this is the most underrated thing in the brain because it's the connection between the forebrain, your optic tantrum, and the optic nerve. The green is actually your optic tantrum. It's actually where the empathy lies, the modeling part. It's actually where you dissect your hearing and your sight. And so it'll go automatically into that and then kick over to make into memory. And then you have the yellow is actually their medulla. The green is the cerebellum. And well, like I said before, when you look at the medulla, the more creases it has, like it actually dives down and back up, is actually a stretching of it because it has more information from overstimulation of tactileness. The cerebellum in snakes goes backwards, like reduced limbs and actual limbless will actually go backwards. Whereas right now, all quadrupeds will actually grow over the optic tantrum. So it goes quadrupeds, ones that have 4 limbs, goes this way over the optic tantrum, whereas the snakes and stuff goes the opposite. So you guys get this, right? Like this is how this is. I think this is pretty basic, right? Is there any questions?
I'm gonna lose this game show already. I can guarantee it. I'm working on a phone. It looks so small. I think I'm fucked.
Yeah, I might be too. I mean, I can see the labels, Daniel, but I'm not sure depending on what type of questions you ask, maybe we'll be able to do this.
Okay. So you get a point if you can tell me something different about this brain, and you get a point for that. You get a point if you can tell me what it is. You get 3 points if you can tell me the species. You get a point if you can tell me what it's from.
Okay, so the black and white picture look like the Great Lakes, and that looks like poop.
Yeah.
Am I close?
Yeah, like it's.
How many points is that?
Give me a second. I'm gonna digest this for a moment. Oh, so you're asking if it's a 4-legged or a snake? You're asking lizard or snake, or is that what the question is?
Anything that you can see different from this to a bearded dragon. This is not a bearded dragon. So what is this species? Is it a lizard? Is it a snake? Do you see anything different about it?
I mean, is this a sea turtle brain?
No.
Oh, damn. I thought it was all full circle from the beginning, man. I thought that was the test.
I have no idea.
I hate to say this. I'm out. I don't think I'm going to get this. I mean, I can make a bunch of guesses, but like...
This is an iguana brain.
Okay.
Basically, it's basically the same thing as a bearded brain.
We got to work on your game shows, buddy. I don't think the crowd's going to like this one.
That's what I was curious about. That's why I'm testing this.
Yeah.
We're gonna get there. We should have practiced beforehand. So can I ask you a question about that scan though?
Yeah.
Is that a captive bred United States bearded dragon, or is that a wild caught bearded dragon?
That's a very good question. That should be a captive bred beardy.
Okay, you know what you should do? You should take a couple days and find something that's wild caught, because I'm sure this has changed over the years, but I heard that originally in the United States, we started with like under 20 bearded dragons, and everything then went from that 20. Now, I'm sure there's been other ones that have come in since then, but originally we had a very small group that we worked with in breeding. And I also heard some of the original bearded dragons that came in the country were significantly bigger. And after years of inbreeding, they became much smaller. And I think that's the difference when you hear people talk about German giants. I think German giants are maybe more of the wild type, or more that wild blood, that they haven't been so overly inbred that they became smaller.
Interesting. That makes sense.
That is interesting, yeah. So what is this?
This is not bearding.
I've seen this scan before, so it would be cheating if I just answer because I've seen this.
Is it ball
picture
python?
before.
If he's seen it, it's probably a ball python.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yes. So we see that the OL stock is massive compared to that. And then you have the forebrain. This goes backwards. It doesn't actually lean over the optic tantrum. It actually goes backwards. You can see that there's more dip here. It's very fascinating, but all the parts are there. There's just increases and decreases.
So if you took a pastel ball python like the original one that Graziani has that's 30 years old now and did a scan of that one's brain and then scanned a pastel ball python created today in the industry, God knows how many generations later, do you think you'd see any big differences?
I don't know, but it's a very good question.
Who knows? I wonder. I mean, I imagine. I wonder. I don't know if you would see structural differences, but because you can imagine humans. Like, I guess that would be a question. You could say, would there be a difference between doing a brain scan of like a hunter-gatherer tribe in the Amazon, like someone who's like an uncontacted tribe, and then one of our brains? Like, would there be actual differences as far as like the anatomy? Who knows? I think they're different.
Not
Like
the anatomy, but the inside of the forebrain would probably have different connections.
so it might not. See, maybe you'd have to put it into like a scanner that would show like the actual, when they show like an MRI or whatever. I'm not sure my medical
Which we
equipment,
can't do with reptiles because they need to be sedated.
right.
Yeah.
And they can't think.
Yeah. So this is something else. This is the last one. Guys, tell me what's different about this to a bearded dragon brain?
It's my left, but that little part in the front there, does that have anything to do with the heat sensors you were talking about for feeding, or are we still focused on the little?
I don't know if the heat sensory goes through that part of the brain, but it is the OL stock.
Okay.
So it's longer, or is it longer?
Yes. It's bigger.
Bigger.
Oh, I got ball pythons, right? I think it's Dylan's turn.
No, that's a point. That's a point for Dylan, or for you guys, both of you. I'll give you a point for that because you both recognize that.
It was teamwork. I just took what was going on around me and went with an obvious answer.
And that's fine. That's great. This is I'm hoping this will be how people learn better. I just need to perfect how I do this, and this is why I'm testing it.
I'll send you some questions after the episode, I promise.
Yes.
I think Dave and I will combine our points. Hopefully they get a prize together that we can share mutually.
What does this forebrain look differently than the actual bearded dragon? What's kind of different about it?
I forget.
I wish I would.
It's stretched.
Okay, run the mouse over the part that's stretched. Tell me about that little red part in the middle you have highlighted.
Yes. Not the red, not that part. The right, you have the OL stock at the front that leads right into the forebrain. That's the big thick part at the top.
Okay.
Whereas the bearded dragon was more round, this is actually stretched a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a simple man with simple thoughts, buddy. We're going to have to work out all this for the simpleton.
And that's okay. That's what I wanted to know. I mean, that is actually important to realize that, like I said, I wanted to test this so that I could start working on this and growing this. And that was a fire skink. We saw that the OL stock on the ball python and the fire skink were more than the OL stock on the beardy. And that makes sense because the fire skink's going to lick. It's going to lick more, and it's going to use that sensory more. And so it actually stretches that forebrain. And that forebrain is memory and decision making and things like that. Problem solving, imagination is in that forebrain. So now you've stretched that. And so then you have the ball python. The OL stock is so thick, it actually pushes back on that forebrain. and actually makes it start to crest around the optic tantrum, kind of like a mammal, but it separates that forebrain. Where a monitor isn't going to separate, so you're stretching, so it'll look like a bearded dragon brain, but yet you stretch the forebrain because it also uses its tongue and smells, a monitor, but yet you don't have the forebrain separating around, and then that thalamus should actually head up between the optic tantrum and the forebrain, and so it allows for quicker response time. And so there's actually more emotional intelligence in a monitor than a ball python, than a snake. And
I agree with that.
That's why it's actually a neuroscience thing, and that's why it's because they basically, a monitor has more information coming into the brain and faster capability of using it, where a skink has a lot of the similars in behavior because it also has that stretched forebrain, but yet there's not as much surface between the optic tantrum and the forebrain to create faster connections. So that's the difference between a skink and a monitor.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you something else I want to know an answer to next time we talk. I do a lot of field herping, and I get bit a lot. I don't like to get bit, but they bite sometimes. Ringnecks, which are very common in the state, will never bite you. You can pick up a million ringnecks, they're not going to bite you. Black rat snakes are also, even the larger ones I find, are usually pretty docile. Sometimes you'll run into one that like puts on attitude. Would they have similar brains because they're not aggressive?
I don't know, but I saw in the I had to use the data from a study for the gecko of the tokay gecko. And I compared it with the same data that they had in the study for day geckos and bearded dragons and ball pythons. The day gecko's brain is super similar to a bearded dragon. It's like 80,000s almost across how they were measuring, where bearded dragon was 90,000. It was a high 80,000s. Bearded dragons was low 90,000s. The tokay gecko was about the same. But that optic tantrum, like I said, you have the modeling. It's where you dissect your sight, and that gets transferred to the forebrain. And that actually all of a sudden had a piece that was 4,000, showing that there's a different shape. And that's because the tokay gecko is often more in the shadows. So therefore you have to go low and slow when you try to handle it. Otherwise, it's very defensive because somehow, I don't know what, because we can't scan it properly to understand it better, that something in that optic tantrum is not picking up on what it needs to recognize that. And this goes back to something I wanted to say. Lori Torini asked a question about, she was like, we don't understand how these things see. So we don't understand if they see us as a whole or individual parts. But yet I use something called the slow blink, where you just kind of slowly blink, and you do.
That's how I let my cats know that I love them, and then they say they love you back.
It works on the other stuff because it tells them that it works on snakes. It works. I had the reticulated pythons at one of the herpetological societies were out, and they were in that exploratory mode. And as soon as I did that, they started coming over to me immediately. I had one wrapped around my neck. There was a kid standing next to me that wanted to touch it. And I'm like, do the slow blink. And everybody's like, I don't like, it's like so lazy that they don't want to do the slow blink. And it's like, eventually his mom got the kid to do it. And that snake immediately went from this position to and headed straight for him, because it's a sign that you're not their predator and you're not scared of them. And so it's really that nonverbal of that. So they are seeing individual. Now, when I take Pitch to the park, my bearded dragon, there was a lady that wanted to hold her and she wanted to put her on her shoulder. I'm like, wait a second, because when you do that, she's going to try to climb to the top of your head and she doesn't realize that you have eyes. So what's interesting about this is now we know that they do see individual parts. So there's either two options here. So it's in the forebrain that they're losing that information somehow of the individual parts, whether it's a conscious decision or whether there's just something there that they don't, either they don't care that you have individual parts, or they just can't recognize in the forebrain your individual parts. Because that sensory that they should be able to tell should be in the optic tantrum, that modeling part. So it's very interesting how that works. It's actually in the forebrain is where that's done, and we don't know what it is because we can't scan. It's very interesting.
So I think we're 2 minutes from noon, so we got 2 more minutes of Dillion before it's over. So I know you want to get a good goodbye with him, but the last thing I just want to say, and I might have mentioned it with you last time, Dillion, was tongue flicker and a ball python. When I present a ball python to somebody to show, I can tell them exactly what it's thinking based on their tongue flicker. Mm-hmm. When you first hand a ball python to anybody, and do this to your ball pythons at home, when you first take it out, if it doesn't flicker its tongue and it doesn't move, it doesn't want to be seen, it's scared. Then you relax for a moment, stay steady, and then what you'll notice, a very quick little flicker with a slight eye adjustment, then followed by a long flicker. The moment that the long flicker starts, the animal then will start investigating and seems more comfortable with you. Tongue flicker is one way in ball pythons that you can tell what the animal is thinking a little bit. Small little signs.
I did an episode on this, that exact thing. I was actually supposed to give a talk yesterday at the Herpetological Society on this. So we know the right side of your brain's imagination, the left side's memory retrieval. Your memory stored all in the forebrain. So if your eyes dart right, you're using your memory. You're thinking of a memory. If your eyes dart left, because the brain does the opposite sides. So if your eyes dart left, you're actually using your imagination. So I actually show a monitor that Trap, one of his shorts. This monitor has been held like this before. You see the long tongue flicks, and then you see it moving to its right. It looks down and then completely changes its eyes to see with the other eye. What happened was it changed from memory to imagination in that moment. It's really fascinating. But the tongue flicks are about how much brain power they are using. And don't quote, or you can quote me on this, but I believe the more up. So when we're being creative, you're using both sides of your brain. You're going back and forth really fast on both sides. So your eyes should dart back and forth. That's the tongue flick. The faster that tongue flick goes, and they've mapped this, the more the brain power is being used. I believe the more the tongue rises up like this, the more imagination they're using, and the more it rises down, the more memory they're using, because it is attached straight to that forebrain.
So I have actually refined my thoughts on the snake tongue. So up is memory, down is imagination. I've kind of seen it in monitors, but it's a lot harder to see in monitors than it is snakes. So up, memory, down is imagination, in between is both. It's using more of the brain. So that's the answer to that.
Because it's that OL stock. Really fascinating, but I could be the opposite of what I thought. It could be, this could be memory and this could be imagination, but anything in between is almost just the amount of brain power they're using. And that goes back to, if they're not that, then they've used their optic tantrum to realize there's some danger here. I don't want to be investigating. Whereas when they stick out their tongue slowly, it's okay. So if you see something and you stick out your tongue and you take in that sensory, it's like you're reinforcing what you see. In snakes, that's what they're doing when they do that quick little tongue flick. It's that reinforcement. My monitors do the exact same thing. They know what I look like, but yet they're reinforcing what they see through that, because that's their sensory input is that much. So then when they stick their tongue out further and they do the flicking up and down, it's just more brain power. kin to being creative. It's really fascinating.
That is interesting. Like I said,
that's really
that's
cool.
one thing I've always told people. Sorry.
No, that's cool. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I agree.
Do you have anything left, Dylan?
No, I think this was great. Like I said, I should really wrap up and head to work, but
Do you have
this
any
as always.
comments on the game show? What should I do better with it?
I think one thing you could do is if you could make a presentation, because the thing is like most people are not going to come in with any of that knowledge, so it's going to be basically impossible for them to answer those questions. What you could do is like an 8 or 9 minute like little presentation on your YouTube channel and say, this is going to be the topics for the game show on tomorrow's episode. So that way your viewers could watch it, and probably the guests should probably watch it as well. And then people can be tested on their knowledge that they gained like a couple of days before from your information, or else it just becomes too difficult.
Really, that's actually a really good idea. Yeah. No, I like that.
There you go.
Yeah.
They let everybody on Jeopardy know the topics before you go on. These people aren't that smart.
See,
Yeah.
it's always it's
Always
not
a
a surprise. Yeah.
I like that. That's a great idea. Thank you. You got any last words or anything, Dylan?
No, this is awesome. As always, it's great chatting with you both. And like we said at the beginning, I think it's just important to have conversations,
I
through
always
dialogue
appreciate
rather than
the-
through writing. Yeah.
Well, Dylan, until next time, buddy. Hopefully we'll do this again. I know I wanted to do a follow-up after we talked to MJ that one time, and I'm sure we'll find another excuse to do another one in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. As always, it's great to see you. And yeah, we'll definitely do another one in the future for sure.
Yeah.
Cool, guys. All right. Well, I'm going to let you guys both go. I will, we'll stay in touch, obviously.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you,
Cool.
Dylan, for everything you've ever done for me. Appreciate you. Have a great
no
day.
worries. Yeah, no worries. Okay, we'll talk to you guys later.
All right, be safe.
Bye.
So what's your thoughts on anything that we've done?
Well, here's the thing. I find myself relatable to people because I have limited knowledge of a lot of things, but I know a little bit about everything. And that's a weird way of putting it, where you know a lot about something, and what you know about, not a lot of other people know. I remember when we spoke at the show, it wasn't what you were saying was over my head, but it was, how do I contribute to this conversation when I don't know enough about this?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, the empathy thing that I've been wanting to teach people and explain to people. So how did you grow up?
I grew up in the woods fishing and catching snakes all day, and then I'd go home.
So for the audience at home, let me show this real quick. This is literally where I grew up, down here towards Anderson and Pineville. Pineville is where I went to school. And it's below Joplin, Missouri. So you go Neosho, you go further down, Pineville. And so I grew up out here. Literally out here in the middle of Nowheresville, like he did. We actually probably have very similar backgrounds in that case. And I find that my empathy comes from the fact that I grew up basically almost an only child with anger issues out in the woods. I didn't have a friend that lived near me as a child till I was in junior high. And then my brother was 5 years older and actually learning disabled. So therefore, you grow your imagination. And so when we look at why people who are actually child abuse, people go into therapy, being therapists, or actual animal rescues, it's because that optic tantrum, that modeling part. So you have to read people to understand their emotions. And when your neurons connect, so neurons that fire together, wire together. So back here is actually in your forebrain is your putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. That's an actual piece of your imagination. And so your way you imagine stuff is what's going to apply to your empathy. So if you're a child that had to use more imagination, and then you actually had to deal with more emotions of other people, those are going to wire together, and you're actually going to be able to put yourself in their shoes better. This is why. And so that's it. It's just that wiring. It's not just you have to be abused. I wasn't abused. I was just neglected almost, just out in the woods. So I had, and anger issues often, it's not anger issues. It's the control of one anger that leads to better empathy. And so I, as a child, had to learn to control my anger issues. So therefore, I grew my empathy. And then I used my imagination, and I have a very visual imagination. This is why you probably have this better understanding of their behavior. Would you say that I'm probably onto something there?
Well, there's a possibility there. I do like to try to look at people and dissect certain things about why they do and what they do. I mean, me personally, because I've always kind of wondered that with me with certain things. So my intelligence isn't from reading. My intelligence is from talking to people. I've never been a very good reader. I want to say in high school, I was probably at like a 5th or 6th grade reading level. I don't know where I peaked out from there, but reading was always a difficulty for me. And it never really caught on. I don't know why. It's just always been a struggle. Spelling too. I mean, I can do it, basic stuff, but then there's some things that like throw me on a loop that I don't fully understand why it does that, but it does that. I've always been really good with body language, though. Like, I find that I could really read people's body language well. I can kind of get a sense on what they're feeling. I pick up on little things that I think other people don't pick up on. Now, why do I focus on those things? I'm not really sure, but it's something that I've always done personally. I've always had this weird attitude, or kind of a joking attitude. In high school, we had this thing called the Pride Award. Perfect attendance, you had to play a sport, you had to be honor roll, you had to this, you had to that, and you get the Pride Award. My senior year, I got the Pride Award, and what the hell was it? They asked me to talk to all my underclassmen about personal responsibility. Now, in high school, I had long purple hair. I played hacky sack with all the alternative kids and drug kids, didn't do drugs myself. I was an anomaly. I looked a certain way, but I wasn't that way at all. So the stereotypes behind me didn't work. But essentially, when I got in front of the whole school, my whole thing was, if I can do it, you can do it, essentially. And that was just kind of like and whatever I said, I can't remember the details, because I also don't write things down before I do things. Everything's always just like, it happens. I don't, my brother just got married. I did my best man speech. I just talked. I get in front of the school. I just talked.
Before I got educated.
Yeah.
No, it's not offensive. That's just, you have these massive tools that I have. I just have also like higher education on top of those tools. These tools are so versatile. Your imagination. Do you see things in your head?
So here's the thing. I see a lot of things, and I write jokes at night, and I do things like that, but I'm also an artist. I used to draw a lot in high school. I used to do a lot of clay stuff. Now, here's the weird thing. I can look at an image, and I can draw it perfectly, but I cannot see something in my head and put it on paper. Like, I literally look like I know what I'm doing to I don't know what I'm doing. And that's one thing. It was always that way with art for me.
And that's just your connections in your forebrain. That's all that is. It's actually a neurological thing. Mike Stefani, would you say also with like me and Bill Stewart, the family therapist, he has this massive empathy. He also talks about comfort of the monitors and stuff like that. You know who I'm talking about, Mike Stefani?
Oh, I love Mike. Yeah.
I know, right? He's so empathetic. I asked him if he sees things in his head. He says he does not. So that's really interesting to me that his empathy is also like ours, but he doesn't see it.
Well, so again, with everybody being custom in their own way, like I have a lot of friends that are bipolar. And I was having a discussion with one of them one time, and, with people that are bipolar, they normally don't realize there's something different about their brain until it's fully developed, and typically it's not fully developed until they're in their mid-20s. So a lot of bipolar people don't realize they're bipolar because they just make the assumption that their way of thinking is how everybody else thinks. Now, when I made a comment to my one friend one time about how, man, I have a lot of bipolar friends, what's that all about? And he made some kind of comment back along the lines of, your calm way of thinking or your calm understanding of things or your level-headedness in certain things are not over-exaggerate, or not letting something blow me out of proportion, I guess you could say. Like, when something's going wrong in life, I find I'm the guy that wants to go in there and fix everything, and I don't get emotional. I don't cry. Like, I just kind of go in and I find solutions to make everybody else's problems go away so they can deal with what they're dealing with the best they can. So like I said, we're all wired differently. I don't think anybody should ever be defined in a certain way. And I do understand, like, you can, with a good understanding of the brain, you can make assumptions or have a better understanding why people are the way they are. And you can do that by looking at people. I can tell you things I'm good at. You can tell me why I'm good at them. Me personally, I just kind of look at people, I look at body language, and that's why the same thing with our reptile discussions. Everything in every discussion we just had was all me based on body language of the animal, and then you broke it down to me on why that body language is what it is.
Yeah. And that goes back to, even that evolutionary biologist, we were talking about this stuff. And it's like, what do you see that you don't think anybody else sees? And I'm sitting here like talking about, okay, so we see that skinks, like Peter Banded skinks and fire skinks, they like to stay above the surface when they're ready to die. It's actually very interesting. And it's like, these are just things that most people never think about. And most people see this stuff. They just don't register that they've seen it. They don't think about it because nobody else is talking about it.
One thing that might be more relatable than telling people about fire skinks is the fact that, if you grew up in the country and you ever had a dog, when it was done, it would just wander off in the woods and die somewhere. Why? Is it they think it'd be easier for us? Is it something in their nature that just tells them to go and die alone in the woods? Like, I don't ever understand that. And then there's also with dogs, they talk about how, like, if the owner's going to pass away, you almost need to take the dog to the owner to see him one last time before he passes away. The dog needs to understand that the person is leaving. I don't know what country it was in, but there was a story, I want to say it might have been in Japan, about a dog that used to follow his owner to the train station every day, see him off, and then show back up at the end of the day and walk home together. And then one day the guy didn't come back from work, he died. And that dog still kept going there every single day, and eventually they ended up naming the train station after this dog. So, like I said, I find it really hard to talk to people to make comparisons to reptiles. I find that mammals are more relatable to people. So where I could tell someone a fire skink will go above ground and die above ground, and there's just something about it. When you talk to them about dogs and empathy and just the way they are, I find that there's a easier connection there. And then transitioning that story into something reptilian, I think they can make better connections.
That's perfect. No, that's wonderful. I love hearing that kind of thing. It's important to develop that stepping stone. And that's,
everybody needs to be taught something, and sometimes you just got to customize it. And like I said, that really, when I talk body language with ball pythons to people, and I could actually show them that tongue flicker at the show and show them that, look at, this is the science behind it. There's something here to this. Like, it gives them more confidence. People go into snakes with no confidence sometimes.
Oh yeah, confidence is so big, and even reptiles have confidence issues. I think that's one of the biggest things that people don't recognize. And it's when you break down body language, since I've actually studied this, it's like I always tell people there's 4 things that you break it down to: comfort, discomfort, confidence, and security. If you stick with those 4, you'll almost always be able to get it right. There's more too with most of this stuff, but if you just stick with those, you're probably going to be okay with understanding the animal.
Yeah, like I said, this is such a young hobby, and even we were talking to my friend Junior from JMG Reptiles, and he's a leopard gecko guy, and he's been doing it since he was in his early teens, and we talked about certain characteristics that could be line bred, and he's all as much as we do in this hobby, they've been line breeding koi for over 100 years. Those were brown carp at one point, and now they're these absolutely beautiful animals with all these different colors that you never could see in the wild. And it's really tough to we're so young in this hobby. And that is the truth. So where we talk about dog breeding and just all the different dog breeds over thousands of years, it's just, we have so much still to learn because we haven't done anything yet. We figured it out. I always make the comparison of Boelen's pythons. Nobody could figure out Boelen's pythons until they actually took a moment to see what they did in the wild naturally. when they saw where they were laying their eggs, they saw the drops in temperature at night that they need. Like, until we started mimicking that, we treated them like any other reptile, and we were never successful breeding them in captivity, and that's even at the zoo level. But then we learned, Ari wrote a great book on that. He's done studies in the wild, but that was a challenging species that now, as long as you go by what happens in nature, you can be successful with them. And again, another joke I make in the hobby, but it's true, and I feel bad every time I say it, but we're used car salesmen that found a similar thing that we all love, and we're all learning together. Not all of us have biology degrees. For the longest time, there was only a few people I even knew in the hobby with biology degrees. This is something that it's almost like self-taught, but we're all learning at the same time because, again, it's so new to us. Yes.
And that's very important to understand, because I'm still learning stuff. Like, it's like, I may seem like that. It's like, no, there's there's so many things that it's just wild that I work for Bear Crop Science. Do you understand how much science is missing from that place? I literally am a chemist there, and it's like, no, we could do better science here, because the paint industry does the same thing that we're doing right now, and it's like, we could do that. Why are we not doing that? It's very fascinating, and that's been around the longest. That's one of the biggest, farming has been around longer than most things, besides maybe prostitution. It's just one of those things, and yet we're still missing pieces of the science. There's always a next question to ask, and I think the questions that you ask are often better questions to ask.
And the reason I just ask them in a way that I need to understand, and honestly, the way I ask it is I do it in a very simple way. Like I said, I'm not extremely book smart. I just have a really good memory for things that I want to remember. I don't remember it all. I'm really bad with names, but a lot of topics I'm able to remember. Certain conversations over the years, get triggered by certain things like anything else. So we have our own way of taking information and passing information. Like I said, I'm intelligent and dumb all at the same time. Could I pass the test? Maybe not. Can I teach somebody something or find a way to make them understand the same way I understand? I believe in that.
Yeah. I'm the guy that the teacher would look to for political class, my world politics class. And then when I told the class the grade that I made, it blew their minds. What grade do you? I literally, the teacher would wait. Me and the teacher would look at each other, wait for the class to answer the question. If nobody had an answer, she would say, Daniel, and then I would answer the question. What grade do you think I got in politics?
I would like to think 100 if you always knew the answer, but did you fail?
Big C.
Okay.
C. But also, I was the guy in chemistry class and general chem that everybody went to for answers, and everybody I helped made a B or better. But I was working at Lazy Boy full time during the nights too, and I would pass out during the tests, and I was making a C. It's wild. Just don't test them.
Like I said, we're all just so different. I did machinery jobs, after high school. I made postage stamps. I did roll-to-roll die cutting. When I was done with that, I worked in another factory making plastic parts, injection molding, and I'm very competitive. I love sports. And I've played a lot of sports over my life, and I've tried to be the best at everyone I could. And even in a factory job, when I walked into my 12-hour shift, I looked at what the shift before me did, and I said, cool, now I got to do better. And because of that, I had a better understanding of the machine. I understand how to fix my problems when they presented themselves. I just found a way to be the best at it. And again, that just comes down to being competitive. And I understand it was a 9-to-5 job, and it didn't change how much I got paid, but it definitely changed how fast the shift went by for me.
there's some famous people that have the imagination and empathy like we've talked about before. One of them was Einstein. He talked about conducting its imagination experimentation, where in his head he would take the universe and play with it in his head. Very fascinating. If you listen to Ridley Scott, I don't know about his empathy, but he has that visual imagination. He talked about seeing the alien and knowing exactly how everything was going to look before it did and exactly how it was going to move and all that stuff. It's really fascinating when you listen to the commentary. There's a football player that everybody calls Magic, that if you actually listen to him, he actually talks about seeing the field and being able to kind of understand the other players probably better than other people. Who do you think that is?
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. There was Aaron Rodgers was in a football game one time, and he looked over the line at the defense, and he literally looked at one of the defensemen and told him, "Hey, you're lined up in the wrong spot for your play right now." As in, he knew what they were all supposed to be doing on every play. He knew what the defense was through and through, and he knew that guy was lined up in the wrong area based on everybody else's lineman on the field.
Yeah. Patrick Mahomes. This is why, like, can imagine, well, I can look over there and throw 30 yards that way because I see it. I know where the defenders are going to be. I see the whole field, and I can actually empathize with how these people are seeing me. It's very fascinating. And that's...
I think, football, there's got to be a certain personality that comes with football, and I think it's pretty common based on position. If you know hockey, everybody always says the goalie's the weird guy on the team. I've always been a goalie in hockey, and I might be the weirdest guy on the team typically. There's just certain things about personality or certain traits that we have that make us more fitting for certain things, I find. And, I don't think it's coincidental that if you name your daughter Sarah, she's probably going to play softball someday. I don't know what that is, but I know a lot of Sarahs that play softball. So I don't know. I believe in certain things like that just happen, and certain small things along the way can make that change.
And that, I think the Sarah thing is more of a cultural thing. It's almost like when you see one movie and then you go, oh, well, there's another one that came out that's almost identical to it at the exact same time, because the way people are thinking is group think. So it's like, okay, so the Hollywood is like, oh, well, the idea that this person had, they got that same idea probably from what this person got the same idea from, because they're running in the same circles. They just did it at the exact same time and felt like they were unique with it. And they were. They just saw it at the same time from the same source. And it's really fascinating how that works.
I think there's a movie coming out that's going to depict a civil war in the United States in modern day, with a lot of comparisons to what goes on modern day, the way the speech is, everything else. Is what it is. I can understand that because I think there's a lot of division in the country right now, but I don't think making a movie about it is necessary, but because it's around us, of course, it's relevant. So of course they did it.
Yeah, I always find I loved Clerks 2 when it first came out, but yet it's so relevant to its time that it's so dated now. It's like, well, the first Transformer movie was coming out, so they talked about it. It's like, how many Transformer movies have we had since then? It's the reason why when I think of stuff and write stuff, I try not to get so dated. It's very interesting. So what were your thoughts on the game show? How could I make it better? You had some comments.
Well, first off, you got to figure out what the game show is exactly. You probably want some consistency. Maybe you're going to, like I made the joke about Jeopardy. They know the topics ahead of time. I don't know if you need to give the answer and they need to give the questions. I think with the brain breakdown, with you running down, okay, here's everything and this is how the brain works. Okay, cool. Now here's a picture of a brain. Tell me what you see. If you go in not knowing to grasp that, look at it, and know what to look for on going from a drawing to literally something that looks like a pile of shit, really hard. Like you can make guesses. I assume that one of them might be a sea turtle brain because you started with a sea turtle. I should have known iguanas because iguanas came up in conversation a long time, but I didn't make that connection. I think your charts need to be improved on a little bit, which I could always help you with that kind of stuff. I'm good on my phone with Photoshop and moving things around.
Yeah.
But
I just want to do something quick to test. Yeah.
No, of course. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think there's a fun way of doing stuff like that. That problem is if you get a bunch of wrong answers, it takes the fun out of the game, and it's a deterrent for the people trying to give the right answer. So it shouldn't be so easy that you get it, but it should be. You got a fighting chance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I said, I want people to go, oh, I know that answer. And I want to bring famous people on like Adam Wickens and people like that to where people want to see it. And then they'll start putting more of them, like raise their self-esteem. I don't want people to think of the guest as stupid, but I want the people at home to go, I know that increase their self-esteem.
Well, again, so coming into this conversation today, like I knew that you and Dillion were more book smart on the topic. I knew that you guys had a better understanding of it than I did, for sure. I just took relatable things for me in that conversation, relating it to certain things I've seen in animals. I showed you my perspective on what I heard coming out of your mouth and what I've seen, which either agreed with what you were saying or maybe put up a little bit of a fight.
And that's perfect. That's actually how we need to be talking about this stuff. That is so important to break that down. When Phil and Roy on Project Herbiculture, when he talks about karate, it's like, and people get mad about it. I'm like, well, that's how Phil deals with it. That's how he sees it. That's his experience. That's the best way for him to do it. And that's what we have to recognize.
No, for sure. Like I said, I think there's fun ways of doing game shows. I mean, I'm still trying to think of like fun things to do, like, because I was supposed to launch my own podcast on the 1st. I didn't do it. I got everything ready, idea-wise, but then I didn't really follow through. Sometimes I find it very difficult to do this kind of stuff when you have so much work to do with the animals. There's a guilt from spending time doing this when I could be cleaning an animal. And as soon as I'm done with this conversation, I'm going to go to Walmart. I'm going to get paper towels. I'm going to get my supplies. I'm going to run home. I'm going to work till 4:30. My Wi-Fi's out. I'm going to have to go to my neighbor's house to watch the Bills game, and then I'm going to go home and work some more. So like, I really want to get into the podcast scene because I really enjoyed this space. And I might have told you, like, the podcast I'm doing, it's going to be called All for One Reptile Podcast. And the reason I'm calling it that is I want to work with a lot of people. I want to bounce around the community a little bit. I want to do things together where you can host it on your channel. I can host it on mine. Like, I just want to not get caught doing the same stale thing. And I do, like with me and you, I've got an understanding of body language. You got an understanding of the brain. So when we talk to people, it's going to be two very different conversations that we have. But because of that, it'll be relatable for somebody else because they'll probably connect to one of us in the conversation.
This is why I say, like, you're always welcome to guest host. Like, I would love to have you guest host because somebody that can actually stop me from over talking is a plus.
Well, here's the thing. I need help to be stopped from over talking myself. When I did my first podcast with Benjamin and Ryan, they used to like give me little signals when they thought I was talking too much. Sometimes I have long-winded questions is the way I like to put it, to where I want to put it really in perspective. Like, I want them to truly understand what I'm asking them and maybe put an example in there. And because of that, I have a long-winded question. There's a balance on this. And here's another thing. We can't all be good at everything. Just because you host a podcast, it doesn't mean we're going to be great at podcasts. We do our best of our ability, but there's always going to probably be somebody that does it better than us. That's just the way it goes.
Since you've met me outside of work, since you've met me outside of this podcast, would you say I'm pretty much the same here as I am outside?
I felt like the conversation was very similar. I felt that I mean, you are the kind of person who wants to educate. You have a very good understanding of something, and you want to pass that on to people because you know a lot of other people have that understanding. Finding the way to do it for everybody to understand is the thing. Like I said, you threw me for a loop a little bit when we first talked. There was a lot of things where the things you said to me, I thought you thought I should have an answer. Like, I thought you thought I should already understand what you were saying. There's a lot of things that we talked about that I didn't have an understanding of. And not that I just nodded my head, but I allowed you to do more talking for me to get a better understanding because of it. You know, some people might get discouraged, but that's not your fault. I like talking sports all the time, and everybody wants to hear me talk about sports.
Yeah.
Sometimes I enjoy talking politics. Nobody wants to talk about politics. It's tough. I mean, you can't always assume everyone's going to relate to everything you're saying. And I always find, here's my best advice. Read the room, buddy. Read that body language. If you notice there's something about that body language of the person you're talking to that maybe that they're not all in on what you're saying, don't abruptly stop what you're saying, but try to find a way to make it relatable so they just start engaging more in the conversation.
And that's why I try to ask questions. I've had biologists at work go, dude, you make me feel stupid. I'm like, I don't want that. I don't want you to feel stupid. Like, I don't like that.
But there's things that I could probably talk about that you won't even have any insight in. You might not even have anything to contribute to the conversation. That's just the way it works. We can't all be good at everything.
Yeah. You got an example?
Do I have an example?
Yeah.
Well, not everybody's good at fishing, buddy, but I've never read a fishing book. I've never read any lure reviews. You put a fishing pole in my hand and send me out in the water, I'm going to probably outfish everybody. Or I'm going to try to outfish everybody. It's something that I've been doing it since I was 2. Again, I can't tell you what reel I use. I can't tell you if I'm using the right rod. I can't tell you the manufacturers on these lures. I can't tell you shit about shit. But I can catch fish, and I can always catch fish, and it's always been that way for me. Show me where they're at. Let me know what you've been doing, and I'll figure out a way. I am kind of stubborn sometimes. I do a lot of trout fishing in the state with my friend Ike, and I do this technique called center pinning, and I love center pinning. It's very effective up north for trout. Trout down here don't give a shit. They do not care about that presentation, and sometimes I'm stubborn, but then while I watch myself get outfished, I adjust. But I don't know, man. I guess when it comes to book smart stuff, I hate to say it, we're not all educated, and the things that we are educated in, we only know what's in that sphere. We only know that one thing. That's why my joke is like one of my strengths in sales is I know a little bit about everything.
Yeah.
Guy comes over to my table, I look him over. I see something that I can say something relatable. And a lot of times it's something sports related. There's always something that somebody has that I can find something to relate to. And then I say something to allow them to do the talking because maybe I don't know the most about that topic, but if I know one thing that makes me seem like I might know a lot, he'll just start talking to me. And that also keeps him on my table a lot longer, keeps him focused on my animals a lot longer. He's not just passing by. Now, don't get me wrong, not everybody is social. You try that with some people and they look at you like, why is this asshole trying to talk to me or try to engage? But I always find that know a little bit about everything, be relatable to almost everybody, and, try not to do all the talking sometimes. And that's definitely one of my failures is sometimes I talk too much.
Yeah, and I mean I just don't want people to feel stupid. Like, I really don't. I want to increase people's self-esteem. I really do, because there's no reason not to. Like, it's like I'm not egotistical. There's so many professors out there that are, I need to be the smartest in the room, so I have to make everybody else feel dumber. And I'm like, those people are miserable, actually. And it's like when you get a good professor who actually wants you to be better than they are, it really shows. Like, it's such a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I said, arrogance doesn't really get you very far in life. And, you can't always expect everyone around you to understand what you do. And, I always make the joke, like in politics, you can show 2 people the exact same video, and both of them will have completely different perspectives on what they just watched. They'll dissect it completely differently. And when you are so one-sided on your thought process, Like, I think that's tough. Like, I try to be open-minded. I do like to debate. I do like to fight. And sometimes, like I said, I'll say the opposite of what you're saying just to challenge your idea, even if I agree with you. But, like, you know, the human mind's weird, buddy. And I think it gets weirder every year.
You have the 9-man rule, which is if there's 10 men in the room and everybody agrees, it's the 9th man's job to disagree. There's also
I think that was World War Z, and that was that Jewish guy, because nobody thought the Holocaust was going to happen. They thought it was impossible. So you always want to have one guy to disagree when everyone else is on the same page.
there's a skit on Saturday Night Live, Republican or not. It's freaking hilarious. And it's just like, yeah, no, freaking, it was so good. It just shows you how similar we sound, and yet you take it so completely, dramatically different. It's so fascinating, all this stuff. You know, I'm supposed to be learning disabled.
I mean, I'm arguably learning disabled because of my reading issues. I don't even know what the hell you call it. It wasn't necessarily diagnosed, but I always made the jokes. So I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, and I went from living in Madison, Wisconsin, where I left my bike in the front yard. I rode my bike down the road with a bucket and a fishing pole and played in the woods all day. And I was like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And then I moved to Buffalo, where we were the only white family. My cousin Brian and my cousin Rachel lived downstairs from me. We were like the only white kids in the entire school, and I couldn't pass the spelling test. I kept getting 26s, 28s. I just couldn't pass them. So they literally put me on a short bus and sent me to a school where there was like 18-year-old kids drooling on themselves when I was 9 years old, and they left me there for like 2 years. Yeah. And the only thing I remember is them teaching me the difference between there and there. Like, nothing else, because I don't even know if we really did anything, but they made a conscious decision to do that. And then I went to a suburb, and they put me in, like, special ed classes because I couldn't keep up with the reading in the classes, and that was always my struggle. And then when I got to another suburb in an even nicer neighborhood in Western New York, they were like, hey, you love art, you're active, you enjoy sports, you this. Let's modify all your classes around the things that you are good at and excel in. And I went from being a 68 average to a 93 to a 98 average my last couple of years because they customized what I needed to learn. And that's the trouble too with schools, is everyone's going to treat you different. I went from, again, inner city school to suburb to nicer suburb, and everyone treated me differently. And by the last one, thank God for the last one, because that one, in my opinion, probably gave me the best kick in the ass for life. Like the best, like, I don't know. And, you know, too, we talk.
I'm basically a high school dropout. In junior high, when I was a junior in high school, I basically dropped out. Since I was learning disabled, but I was always good at math. Always. So nobody, not one person ever went, you can do a lot with math, stick with it. So when I was a senior, they were like, well, you're LD, so you're learning disabled, so all you got to do is show up and show a pay stub, show that you can hold down a job. And I did that. And I wish I hadn't have, because if I'd have went and got my GED when I went back to college when I was 26, and freaking, I would have gotten a free ride if I'd have done well on the GED. Like, I would have gotten my college paid for a while. And I learned gambling techniques. And so freaking, that's how I started with physics. But I was going, okay, I want to go back to school. I want to get out of lazy boy working here at this factory job. So I'm going to go for alternative energies. And Crowder College in Neosho was really good for that. So it's like, okay. So I was on a road trip. My motorcycle broke down. I didn't have any channels at the house at the time. So I watched a show called Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman on black holes. And I was like, dude, I know that before the commercials, and they would come back and reinforce it after the commercial. I bought the book from that show, Leonard Susskind's My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the Universe Safe for Quantum Mechanics, The Black Hole Wars. He's a physicist in California, And so it was 400 and something pages, took me 2 months to read. I switched to physics, and now I have an associate's in physics because of that. It was it's such an interesting thing to go from you're learning disabled, and I had to go from pre-algebra to calculus 3 and differential equations and freaking physics and stuff like that. And I mean, it was huge. So I had to take extra time in just that alone. It's quite fascinating.
Well, similar to me, like I never went to college because I didn't think I would be able to hang. For a while I thought about I wanted to be an art teacher maybe, but then I thought it'd be very silly if my students were smarter than me. And I had a lot of things that discouraged me from ever going to it. And, we had the conversation earlier that Dillion brought up about people getting into this, wanting to do it for a living and everything else. When I was 18 years old, and I talk about this a lot, my local pet store, Markheim's, had a gentleman working there. His name was Ken Leach. And Ken did Kenyan sand boas, ironically. And I went in there and I bought a couple Amazon tree boas, and then I bought a Brazilian rainbow boa. And then he started telling me about the shows, and he started telling me about the breeding, and told me how I spend so much money at the pet stores and I need to start going to the shows if I'm going to keep buying the way I do. And he kind of gave me a lot of nudges, taught me a lot of how to conduct yourself, but he essentially taught me things about the industry if you're wanting to get into the industry. And it was a lot of tough love conversations, in my opinion. Yeah. And long story short, that was always the dream. When I started learning about all this stuff, I was already obsessed with reptiles. I bought a boa when I was 8 years old. I always loved reptiles, and the idea of working with animals and doing these really cool manipulating different colors, creating new things, that was it. That's all I ever wanted when I learned it. So when we talk about why certain people get into the industry, and then we try to put this cloud over the idea of doing it for a living, that sucks. There's only so many things that I'm going to be able to do in life. And for the most part, I've spent the last 20 years of my life devoting every minute of my day to learning more and just talking reptiles. It'll be sad if this is taken away someday. I did factory jobs because I thought that was all I was capable of doing. And that's why I did them for almost 10 years of my life.
The only thing that pays back home.
Yeah. I think I was doing $10 an hour at one job for the longest time. I was taking home a check of $300 after taxes. I would pay all my bills, and at the end of the month, whatever money I had left, I'd go to the Cleveland Reptile Show or Columbus Reptile Show or White Plains Show, and I'd buy one animal. And I did that for years. I never really had a lot getting into this. It was the work I put into it gave me something to put back into it, and then it just kept on building. But I don't know, man. Like I said, I don't think it should be a negative to want to do this for a living. I think every situation is different. And, I understand some people come in with the money aspect, and don't get me wrong, you need to make money if you're going to do this for a living. You got to support yourself. But, I always joke around, a lot of reptile breeders were just gypsies our entire life. We never have enough to sustain a family with the money. We kind of just do it because we love it and we want to do it. And I hate when you mix money into it, it turns into a whole nother thing. But this was all I ever wanted to do. And
I had decided not to talk about this, but I think it's a good thing to talk about. I've been thinking about relationships recently, and you start thinking about the fact that, I'm actually very good with psychology and stuff. It's the reason why I didn't go into psychology, because it's why would I have somebody teach me something I can already do? Why that's stupid. Why I'll go to chemistry and physics, do things that I have to have somebody teach me. So it's I know it has to have work. I know, you have to put the work in. And it's so interesting when we look at actual reptile keepers. And it's I always explain to people, so dog versus reptiles are like my grandparents. My grandmother was a saint. She's like a dog. We could do no wrong. She's just absolute saint. Just love you no matter what you did wrong. But my grandfather was like a reptile. If you gotta love you, you earned it. It's, and so it's almost like if you want to be a reptile keeper, you should almost, you have to put in work to get very little out, but it's to some people that might actually be more sustainable and actually be more important because you're not just getting it all the time. Whereas some people kind of need that constant reassurance, and there's nothing wrong with either side. There's nothing wrong. It's just you as a person, and it's very fascinating. So it's like when we look at actual relationship, and I even tell you, like, it's like the reptiles are a relationship. I have a bearded dragon that literally talks to me when he wants to get out to go poop. Like, he literally like, hey, I need to go, man. And he's like, I'm done. It's like, okay, man. And so we have this relationship, and it's so... And there's so little reward, but that reward kind of escalates because there's so little of it. So when we look at relationships, you go, okay, I have to put in all this work. So it's kind of like, oh, well, reptile keepers are the perfect boyfriend, the perfect relationship partner, because we're willing to put in work for little reward, but it's actually also the money wise, and that's the most reason why people get divorced. So it's like, it's kind of a catch-22 kind of thing. It's very interesting when you look at it like that.
No, there's a truth there. Don't get me wrong. There are people in this hobby that are extremely successful, but like, I always make the comparison of Justin Quebeca. I remember seeing him coming up in the game early on. I remember seeing him at shows like way back, even when I was nobody, and he had like one display on his table. And now he's kind of like the gold standard if you're a ball python breeder. Like, he is a guy that's dictating the way certain projects are managed. He's dictating prices in the market, coming out with things before other people. Not many people are able to do what he does. And, here's the thing. We're not all created equally. He went to school for business. He has an understanding of how to run a business. Some of us just thought we'd buy reptiles and run a business. So, certain people with their backgrounds can make them better at this if they can relate it to the hobby. But, again, you can give everybody $10,000. You got to give them all the same opportunities, and only 1 out of 10 will probably survive in the hobby. It's a very difficult hobby, and hard times are very hard. And, you hear a lot of people complain about what the industry is doing now. These times happen. There's always been this in the hobby, and we always ignore, like, you can literally relate everything in this hobby to what the economy is doing. And every rise and fall of almost every project in this hobby, you can usually do it based around what the economy is doing. Some people, Bill Brandt told me once that the hobby is recession proof. And I do believe there's a little bit of a truth there. But I do believe that in that process, we are going to lose people. And I think we always lose people. But some people need to fail for others to succeed sometimes.
Yeah, like everybody thinks that, I hear that all the time. It's, what is it? Oh God, I hate advice so much because people never give advice for the person taking the advice. They give advice for the person giving the advice. Well, I feel better about myself because I told you that, you should be yourself. So if you want a relationship, you should be yourself. It's like, well, why is that person being somebody else? Oh, they haven't been somebody else? Then what are you talking about? Yeah, they should make a change. So I know, like, if you're not getting what you want, yeah, you should make a change. I always tell guys, it's okay if you have 3 women or more that like you, that would date you under different circumstances, you have little changes to make. If you don't, then you have bigger changes to make. So it's really fascinating.
The honeymoon phase of a relationship is not always you showing you exactly who you are, you trying to be the best as possible in the whole courting ritual, but then your true colors come out, and that's why it's not always a honeymoon. That's why over time relationships change. I just think everything's different. Like I said, you can't put everything into a box. You can't really judge everybody the same way. I mean, everything is its own custom deal with everybody. Like, nothing is the same. You know what I mean? Like, you talk brains and you talk the way the inner workings work, but then there's always going to be a variable in there that's going to give you something completely different.
Yeah, and then that honeymoon phase is also what you see in reptile keepers. I got this really cool like reptile. Oh my God! And then several months later, it's like, I got that reptile.
Well, it's like, I find that too from a business standpoint when people come in looking at more of the money aspect and they start counting their dollars before they make them, and I think that's just silly. I think we all make that mistake sometimes. I mean, if you're gonna invest in something, you're probably gonna try to work it out in your head when you'll have a return in that investment, and that goes for any business. I don't care if it's live animals or anything. If you don't look at stuff like that, you're not running a business. You have a hobby. So, you know, again, people hate talking about this kind of stuff when it comes to living animals, but, you know, people buy an animal, they say, cool, I'm going to raise it for 3 years. I'll be able to make this much money on the first clutch or first litter. Then I'll reinvest this much, and like start going over everything. And next thing you know, there's fluctuations in the market. The desire for the species that they bought is not as popular when they go to sell it. Then 20 years later, it becomes popular again. There's just a lot of working variables in this, and I think that's why we don't always succeed. I mean, I feel like I'm on the brink of failure always. I just don't want to fail. But you know, when things get hard, and we get negative.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting how many times you get people in the hobby and they think all our problems are so unique. Oh man, you know, it's like, but then you go, no, that same problem's in that. Like they have the exact same problems we do. It's just, how do you, so looking, it's the same thing as what I was talking about with the agriculture and how it's like, well, no, it's this other stuff. It has the same problems. For some reason, we're just not looking over there because we feel like, you know, we have the answers. We've been doing it this way for so long. And it's like, no, you got to look at something else once in a while. You got to break away.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, like you said, I don't know, man. I enjoy the negative. I enjoy the positive. I hate when we all get caught up in this negative stuff. And like I said, I do love these discussions of talking about the animals. I just hate when it's like too confrontational. I hate when there's arrogance in the conversation. Science is always changing. I hate to say that. We don't always know everything, and I just don't think there's enough case studies.
Yeah, no, you're right. No, and you know, I tried to push back on you and Dylan. I didn't want to like be like, oh yeah, you know, like this is like, it's like, no, I heard something like that from you guys. I love it if people would do that to me. Like, it's like, you should. Like, I've made mistakes. I've realized that, you know, like, oh wow, you know, I made that mistake. Okay, so, you know, it teaches us stuff, but often my mistakes are, you know, memory related to stuff. So it's very interesting, and at least the reason why I found the sea turtles is because I was trying to disprove a theory. Like, I'm a scientist, so it's like, you know, where you do the scientific experimentation, try to disprove your own theory. Your theory needs to be falsifiable. It needs to have the ability to be proven false. If it can never be proven false, then it's just an idea. You shouldn't use it as a theory. So it's like, okay, so the size of the forebrain may correlate with the size of the territory, since it actually is correlated to memory. I think where my problem is with that, now that I've looked at it, is that it goes back to what we can't scan in their brains, the functionality of that forebrain. And so I think it's part of the calculations. So I was like, okay, so how do I disprove this? What species has the biggest territory? The freaking leatherback sea turtle. Yeah, like if you look at the actual territory where leatherbacks are at, all over the globe, anywhere where it's water inside the like continents, like oceans, that's their territory because they ride that current. But all these smaller sea turtles stay in the shallows. There's only like one or other ones that ride those currents, but then they still go back into the shallows more. It's really fascinating, and that's where I found that sea turtle thing, and that's a study that was done in Japan, and it's like, that's really cool. And so, yeah, I take it as, okay, so this sees it this way, and this sees it this way, and, you know, I can break down all the brains in the kind of about 6 different categories, and blind species are a category into themselves, because that's what the sea turtle was. That's what that leatherback was. It's basically one format instead of the humps. It's really fascinating.
So, you know, other things too, talking about like animal migration, the monarch butterfly, buddy. I think, is it 2, 3, or 4 generations die off on the process of their migration from Canada down to Mexico, but they just know where they're going. They've never been there. Their ancestors died before they even got there, as in a generation or 2 beforehand, but they still get there. And you probably remember like a year ago or 2 years ago, monarch butterflies were on the endangered species list. They just took them off. I don't know what we changed. I know milkweed was an issue. I know that pesticides are killing a lot of them off, but again, that is an animal that migrates from Canada to Mexico, and it doesn't make it all the way there. It dies, and the next generation goes a little further and a little further, and then they backtrack. So what is that? Like, that's where I say the word instinctual, because they just simply know they've never been there. It's not like a salmon being born in a river and going back someday. They just simply know where they're going, even though they've never been there.
They were testing time. And so there's different different moths. And so they took them when they were changing over. So it's a big gelatin with a nervous system. They took that nervous system and placed it into a different gelatin, and it had the same time. It kept the same time. It was really fascinating. It shows you that memory is DNA. DNA has memory in it. It is the killer bees is a really cool example of like how evolution happened so fast. They mixed a South American bee with a bee from Europe. And so they came up with the killer bees. They killed about 7 people on its way to America, to North America, to U.S. And I think they may have gotten 1 person in the U.S., maybe, because they mixed with the northern bees and the North American bees and became docile again. It's really just, it's about generations and usage. It's really cool because evolution, everybody wants to believe it's this mass. The moths when the revolution started and they were doing coal plants and stuff like that in this town, and these white moths were around, within a couple of years they were black because they were getting on the trees, and because they were faster with the evolution because they wanted to blend in. It was really cool how that worked.
Okay, I've always, I'd love to hear someday like a real so ball pythons, like I said, there's over 300 mutations, and I bet you there's probably another 50 or 100 more we don't even know about right now in captivity. Yeah. What is it about that species that it morphs so much? Like, why is it because we collect so many? Like, what is it about that species?
I don't know. That is a very good question, and that is very, man, it's so.
We have corn snakes in the United States, and they're plentiful in areas where there's good populations. And I think in the last decade, I can only think of like 2 or 3 new mutations that have popped up that were found in the wild. And a lot of times you find it's the same mutation over and over again. And then, like, in some of the stuff, like we talk about, I bring this up a lot, but melanistic garter snakes in Ohio, there is a county that has melanistic garter snakes. It's because at one point that just became the dominant mutation in the area. It passed on. It didn't affect their life in any way. They weren't getting picked off by predators. Not like they had big white spots on them. They blended in. But some reason they went black and that became dominant. And then I kind of wondered, like, seeing it's colder in Ohio, are they jet black now because they're absorbing more of that heat from the sun before they go underground or whatever else when it's colder conditions? Like, was there something that they adapted to through a mutation and evolution, or why did that happen? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've thought kind of about this because it's like, well, in the wild, you're probably not seeing that many different ball pythons. So it's like, why all of a sudden, we have this diversity? It's very interesting. It's.
There's some mutations that had popped up, like I believe in National Geographic back in the 60s, there was a pied ball python, and there's been pied ball pythons over the years. Like, that's just not an uncommon thing. But all these other ones, man, like I said, and there are so many ball python mutations. It's literally never ending. And compared to any other species out there, like hell, even sea turtles. My little brother's friend's wife does sea turtle studies down in Florida, marks the nests and everything else. And she says every year they'll see an albino, they'll see a leucistic, at least one. Well, why aren't they seeing other things? Why aren't they seeing hypomelanistics? Why aren't they seeing melanistics? Why aren't they seeing pieds? Like, why are those the dominant genes? Like, why aren't other genes morphing up in this species? I understand why they keep on getting it, because of course there's X amount of hets out there and you're bound to run into another het along the way, but why isn't there other mutations? Like, why are they so limited to just the 2 or 3?
It is, and it's so I didn't have a real understanding of cell biology until the guy at work was an actual biology high school teacher, and he was explaining it. And it's like, it's what, like, DNA is not, like, we want to, like, almost see DNA as this, like, magical thing. Oftentimes we almost see biology as this magic. And it's like, it's not actually magic. There's something to it. We almost see it as it's micro. Like, it's like, oh, well, it's, you know, along the lines of a electron. But it's like, it's not that small. You can actually see it with a regular microscope. It's actually in the macro world. Our coding actually has bacteria and stuff. We were made actually from bacteria. And it's so interesting when we start looking at the cells as actually being their own little, like, living systems, and how they just kind of create themselves. Like, they're literally a workforce in themselves. I actually was at a conference, and he was so damn monotoned. The guys, they walk and they move 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. It was like, oh my God, start up. But it was so interesting because the chromatids actually move 3 steps forward, 2 steps back when they're delivering your proteins. So that way you're not overwhelmed with your proteins. And they kind of slip in, and they're planning for that. There's actually planning that goes on inside your cell. It's so interesting, and that's why you use it or lose it. Because those cells, they go, okay, we're not going to put information here because you're not giving us the energy to do that because you're not actually using it.
So this is random, and then I think we're going to probably call it so I can go get some work done, because we'll keep going on this for hours. Kevin McCurley has a very good understanding of monitors and a very good understanding of retics and retic body language. You know, some of the things I talk about in ball pythons were from reading that I did about him talking about retics in old reptile magazines. I don't know how easy it is to get that guy, because I know he's got all his own things going on, but, you know, you want to talk about a guy. What's that?
I've tried to get him on because I did this, like, originally I got people on to do a study to try to study empathy in the hobby. And so, yeah, you're like, the way I see empathy, this guy is somebody that you want on. And I just couldn't never get connected with him.
Maybe that's something, if I could set it up, we'll come back and do something together where we could talk to him and maybe incorporate one other person that can contribute to the conversation. But, you know, he's definitely a guy that has taught a lot of people, and a lot of what I understand on body language is based on what I've done on his reading or just listening to him talk. So he's definitely a guy with a good understanding.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing. I wanted to bring him on with a guy that befriended a wild fish.
Okay. Oh, is it that one guy with that bass? He keeps on going back and seeing that thing? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a smallmouth bass.
Yeah, being that guy, we were talking about it, and he makes the slow movements that are steady, and so he doesn't spook the things. But then because all vertebrates have the same parts of the brain. We all evolved. You go far enough back, you have the same ancestry as the ball pythons that you keep. If you go far enough back, like it's, invertebrates I've just started looking into, and it's wild.
Interesting.
It is.
They did that documentary on Netflix. I can't remember the name, and I didn't watch it, but I know it made a lot of people cry. It was the one with that octopus, where that gentleman created a relationship with this octopus and kept on going back to see it, and then it, of course, died one day because they have short lifespans. But it was like, have you seen that documentary? If not, I'm going to find it. I'm going to send you a link. And you did?
I have not, but I get what you're saying.
All right. We should probably both watch that, because that has a lot to do with what we're talking about.
One of the things that I've kind of wanted to do is to actually do like lives where we have people like you and me would sit down and actually watch a video from like Dave Kaufman or something and try to figure out the body language of these animals as they try to be predators and stuff. The problem that I have with that is that a lot of that stuff's staged.
Yeah, there is a truth there. To an extent, a lot of stuff is staged, any of that stuff. No, I do like the idea of critiquing certain videos, or at least having fun and kind of talking out loud while watching it, maybe saying what people are thinking.
I think I sent you that link to, well, I know I sent you the link to the Trap Talk. He did the short where that monitor did that, because there was such a great example of a brain switching from memory to imagination. Like, it was just a perfect deal to see that. It's like, no, this is really cool. And it's such an interesting way of looking at it to understand what they're actually thinking and how they're thinking. Because most people never think about these animals as having imaginations. Our imaginations are probably from trying to avoid predators and actually ambushing. When I had, Reptiles and Research on, he talked about the fact that a lot of vipers and stuff will actually flatten the grass. It's like, well, you know, if it's a new viper, they don't know. Like, it's not like, oh, well, I'm trained to do this. It's, I imagine that something's going to walk by that I can eat. So it's an imagination thing. It's the reason why we go back to looking at these animals as autistic, because when we look at a cat versus iguana, we see that the iguana brain's already developed. We are actually one of the rarest species on Earth that our brains have to take development time after we hatch, after we're born. Whereas most species, their brains are almost fully developed. So the cat still has to learn, so it wrinkles. While an iguana, you don't want it to wrinkle because they might lose that information that they already have and need to hold on to. Very fascinating. And so that's why I consider, because everybody wants to think of autistic people as stupid. But it's like, no, autistic people, I still have people at work that are autistic that clean the bathrooms. They walk, they eat, they order food, they know how to clean stuff. The bathrooms don't look like shit. It's like they do function. They just may not have the greater functionality of other things. So it may be harder for them to learn because the connections are already made that shouldn't have been made yet.
I think it's on one of my videos that pops up, or maybe it's on Facebook, so I click on it so much, but there is this, I don't know if it's Down syndrome or autism. I think, I don't know, it might have been Down syndrome, but he's a cook, and he does a recipe, and he makes he's slow cooking meats, and he's doing macaroni and cheeses, and like, I understand, you know, we all have our, sometimes those guys are savants in a way, though. Yeah. Like, you know, once they figure out that one thing, they become unbelievable at it, but then they can't do anything else.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, it's not always the forebrain that gets overgrown. There may actually be too much fluid in their heads. And now you get this massive headache all the time. There's other parts of the brain, so they may be enlarged. It may not be the full forebrain that gets enlarged before the age of 2. So it's really fascinating. And so when you look at reptiles like this, it kind of opens up. I was talking to, I'm sure you know, Ark, the guy with the mohawk. He has the eggs and the turtles at the shows.
I don't know him personally, but I know him.
Yeah. We were talking about this, and it's like every time you talk about it, like he was breaking down the autistic person that he works with, and I'm like, is that not a reptile? Is that not describing a reptile? And he's like, oh my God, yeah. Like, it's so interesting when you start looking at it like this. And so instead of being judgmental, like, I want to believe that I'm better, there's a part of the brain that when you die and they bring you back at the hospital, it actually stops. It's the ego. Like, it actually, so it's almost like, like you almost lose like, oh well, this is a personal attack, everything. And this is what we see from open-minded people. They don't believe everything's an attack on them. It's really fascinating how that works.
I don't know if I'm registering this the right way, but is the ego going away just because the helplessness?
See, this goes back to the animals dying and like moving out. I wonder if that part of their brain, like that, because survival, because the reason why we need ego is to want to pass on our genes and want to survive. So that's where ego comes in evolutionary wise, where it's like survival is actually ego. It's really fascinating when I start looking at it like that, where it's like, okay, so then if they're on their deathbed, are they coming out to go try to heal? Because they'll also do that. I have a blind Peter Bandit skink that stays out all day. Because one guy at the shows, we often talk, and he talks about the fact that if you want to cure something in an animal, bacteria can only live up to a certain temperature. So you want to get that animal as high as you can without it dying. Keep it hydrated for 48 hours. And when people like Jeff Brigler, our state herpetologist here in Missouri, when they cure fungus on hellbenders, that's what they do. They actually raise that temperature up. And so that way you kill the fungus, but not the animal. And you do that for 48 hours. So are these animals coming up to the surface to sit in the sun to create their own fever? Or is it possible that they've lost that part of their ego in their brain? And it could be both. Like it could be either or.
That's very interesting, actually. I'd be curious about that. I do like all the fungal stuff. I've watched a lot of documentaries on fungal stuff, and I think they even had that one show that came out a year ago where it showed us all getting that fungus disease. I don't know what it was called, but it was pretty much fungus dies at a certain temperature, and it was able to live like 2 degrees higher, and it started taking over our bodies.
Yeah.
No, I like all that. Another thing, and now we're fucking done after this.
Yeah, I understand.
I think it's The Amazing World of Fungi or something like that documentary, and it actually talks about it might have been early hominid that would walk across the deserts in Africa, and along the way there would be cattle or some kind of, I don't remember what kind of, might have been wildebeest, I don't know. They would shit and mushrooms would grow on it, and they would eat them, and they would have trips in a sense. And I think the whole discussion was like the evolution of the brain and how like it just jumped up. Like it just, like our intelligence, like not overnight, but when you look at evolution, it happened fast. And they were almost wondering whether or not these psychedelic mushrooms were opening up a part of your brain and actually causing evolution in your brain.
Meteors? Oh,
bringing fungus down? I know every fungus is foreign, right?
I don't know that part, but they do have a spot in the rock where you see like a change in bacteria stuff, and they think that might have been because, like I just said, your DNA has bacteria in it, and they theorize that it's possible that a comet came by and that actually gave us the bacteria to become more intelligent. And it's very interesting. And so they had a comet land back in the 90s in a desert. And the town that was the closest to it all started getting sick. That's how come they knew that, the meteor landed. And so that's how they knew that comets and meteors actually do have bacteria on it.
I believe that. I think I saw a story the other day that there was some old bacteria that they found. I don't know if it was in Antarctica or where, but I think like one of their scientists like injected it himself the other day. I feel like it popped up. I didn't get to read it, but it was just like a quick little thing that popped up. And trying to understand like the brain, DMT and DMT trips. The drug or DMT, right?
I hear what you said.
And so, like in Egyptian culture, like there's always the drawing on the all-seeing eye, I believe it is. And like if you split your brain down the middle, at the base of your brain where DMT actually is, it looks like the all-seeing eye. And it's kind of fascinating that cultures back then, because they found in some of the pottery that they can find it's laced with DMT or different drugs or hallucinogens. I find it kind of curious that a culture back then could have that much of an understanding about a brain. You know what I mean? Like,
I've read one chapter on there's a book that I picked up years ago when I was first starting college, Fire in the Brain. And that's what they were talking about, is that eye and how it's in every culture and stuff. And it's like, we do actually have the stem for a parietal eye.
yep. And you remember when we learned when we were little kids how they'd mummify a person and pull the brain out of the nose? Like, I don't know if when they took the brain out because of the mummification process, they take it out because they wanted to take the things inside it they could still use. I don't know if they were eating. I know they put the organs in like little pots around them, if I remember right. But it was just a whole big ritualistic process. But no, I just find it funny. Like, I don't know. We really don't know anything about anything, in all honesty. Like, I can't even understand how a culture back then would even have an understanding about that. Yeah. And then, like, you got those guys like, is it like Graham Hitchcock, who talks about how, like, we may have been here before in a sense. Like, our intelligence, our technology in a sense could have been here 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, but was erased in time.
Yeah, 40 years since Chernobyl. And literally that place has been completely overwhelmed. With like, you can barely make it out sometimes in some spots. Like, it's a good, I actually have a bachelor's in polymer chemistry focused on medical technology. I studied how to use polymers to target cancer cells, Zika, Ebola, things like that. A good virus doesn't kill its host. It adapts with it.
Yeah, I heard that the other day. That's probably cancer. It attacks everything about its host and kills it. If it was smarter, it wouldn't.
Yeah. It's very fascinating. I actually did a video about my degree and the degrees around it that actually have to do with Brian Barchuk's cancer kind of stuff. I don't know how many. Yeah, like I literally, if I'd have gotten in grad school, which I did get in grad school, I just couldn't afford to go to grad school. I would have been growing my own cancer cells and actually targeting them, figuring out polymers and stuff to target them. And yeah, so there's other fields and stuff too that you can go into. It's just not mainstream yet to target. And so that the chemo doesn't just go all over the body, it actually targets directly to the cancer cells themselves. And that would have been the best that would have been the best way to do his cancer, since it was inoperable.
I think it's called turkey tail. I think it was turkey tail. It's a form of mushroom, and this one guy talks about how his mother had cancer. I think it was breast cancer, and she went into a study, and everybody in the study all got the same drugs. The only difference is she was also, I believe it was turkey tail she was taking, and she was the only one to survive after the study. And, there's so many different healing, like different cultures have healed with natural things over the years. They figured it out. Aloe vera, on burns.
There's a weed that farmers burn. Indians used to smoke it. And University of Oklahoma came to my college and they were talking about it. And they synthesized it because it actually had cancer-fighting properties. But yet, when you look at the molecule, it's like this big. And when you actually look at the synthesized molecule, it's like this. Like, it's like dramatically different looking, but it does the same thing because of manufacturing, and they add things to improve on it. So that's why it looks so dramatically different. It's really wild how that works. I want to use LSD to work with Parkinson's, because Parkinson's has misfiring neurons, and they have learned that even small doses of LSD will make your neurons jump. Because it's very interesting. Even if this one fires up front and this one fires in the back, they could still connect, even though they're not really firing in between. And so that's what's happening when you do the LSD and also Parkinson's. So it's maybe we can actually work, but you don't have as much control over it. So it's very fascinating.
Okay, so I don't know if it's because the information I consume and how I consume it, because like I said, the way I learn is probably different than other people. But I went my entire life without doing drugs. Didn't smoke pot my entire life, pretty much. Just was always very against it.
I can't say the same.
Yeah. When I turned 30 or around 30 years old, I did mushrooms one time, and I do them like once a year now. I find that the month afterwards, my speech slows down. I'm calmer. Like my whole thought process feels a little bit different. And it's not that I'm high the whole time, but it's just like, it's no different than like microdosing for people with depression or people with bipolar. Microdosing helps people. There's just something about that. And I don't know if I was able to I don't know if it changed my brain in a way because I did mushrooms 10 times my entire life, but like I'm glad I didn't do that shit when I was younger.
I know you need to go. We probably need to shut this down, but remind me sometime to talk about reptiles getting high, animals getting high.
Yeah, monkeys do that. There's a few animals that do that.
Interesting that your levels of being high and stuff have to do with your metabolism. Reptiles don't have the same type of metabolism. Your addiction rate actually does with metabolism. The faster you metabolize stuff, the more addiction you're going to have. The slower you metabolize, the less addiction you have. That's why some people can quit cold turkey and other people can't. So reptiles, think about how they metabolize. That's really fascinating to kind of, so if they slow their metabolism down or speed it up, maybe that's why they kind of space out. Maybe it's really fascinating. I gave Pitch the bitch when she was younger. I gave her a fermented apple and she licked it and then ran around the tank for like a couple minutes, just licking everything. And then by the end of the day, they were like just out of it. Like they were just done. Like they wouldn't eat another one. Like it was done. They're not out there. Unlike a moose or something that loves to eat fermented apples. It's like, yeah.
Pandas get a little high off the bamboo, right?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'll look that up.
I think there's a high they might get from bamboo. I might be mixing that up, but I really thought I heard something one time that bamboos actually get a little high from eating, or pandas get high from bamboo.
Dogs are supposed to get a little high from rubbing behind their ears.
They do love that.
Yeah, like they're supposed to. It's literally there's an endorphin in there because that's what's happening in the brain. Your brain doesn't see trauma, like emotional and physical trauma, any different. So there's a lot of things. So when you talk about like happiness, it's probably not going to see emotional and physical happiness any different. A lot of things are just not different where we want to believe they are, because to us they're a difference, but yet our brain doesn't see them any different. It's really fascinating. And it's, I mean, and going back to like that empathy thing, there's a dog at a show, at a buddy of mine, or not a buddy. I was trying to join like a writing group when I first got out of college, and the guy had his service dog. And so I realized that this dog has this vest on, so it's super hot. It had big fur on it. The Lassie almost type dog. So maybe a golden retriever, maybe like something like that. So like it had a lot of fur on it. I haven't dealt with dogs in so many years. And so I recognized that this thing's probably hot. So I started scratching. Like this dog didn't come to me right away. Like it went to everybody else, kind of avoided me. And then towards like somewhere during the middle of the day, I'm like, okay, so this dog's come to pet me. I scratch it behind the ears. I scratch it underneath that vest because I know it's going to be hot. And you could just feel how sweaty it was. And that dog laid at my feet afterwards. He was so just like, we just don't recognize the amount that you can think of with empathy, the actual choices you make. My reptiles, they're way more likely to communicate with me because they feel heard.
I can understand that.
They may not have a lot of desires, but they still feel heard.
Well, and again, what is that? Dogs are special, and that's why I do like, the dog comparison. A lot of these conversations, it's relatable. And, what do people always say? Like, if you die in your house with your dog, it'll probably just lay there with you and starve to death. If you die in your house with your cats, they'll eat you.
Your cat will eat you. Yeah.
But all right, man. How about this? Why don't we plan something again in the near future? We'll try to think of something we want to collaborate on together, and we'll go at it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'll send you that episode that I did on the actual nonverbals, the neurological nonverbal stuff, and see your take on it and stuff.
Yeah, just drop it in a text message, man. I work all day long, and all I do is listen to podcasts.
Yeah. All right. Hey, I appreciate you coming on, audience. Thank you. Like, subscribe, and share, people.